It's one thing to die, it's another thing for the camera to keep recording when it happens. Hi, I'm Christopher, and today I'm covering people who unknowingly captured their final moments around wild animals. From a content creator who walked toward a cassowary trying to get the perfect selfie to a TikToker who started dancing in front of a herd of elephants just for content. It was September 29th, 2018, along a rainforest trail within Daintree National Park in far north Queensland, near the township of Mossman. By the time the first hikers stopped with their voice raised into the quiet canopy, the damage had already been done. Maricel Quint, known to most people as Marie, was 24 and living in Eugene, Oregon, where she worked part-time managing front desk operations at a small yoga studio while building a modest online following centered on yoga and wellness content filmed in outdoor settings. She loves bringing up the concept of being one with nature in her videos. Based on my research, she had no formal background in wildlife, no outdoor certifications, and no history of backcountry travel. Her familiarity with nature likely came from accessible viewpoints, roadside stops, and short hikes documented for social media. She had arrived in Queensland 3 days earlier on a content-focused trip planned around filming yoga sequences at scenic drives and national park landmarks. Her stated goal for the trip, based on her recent posts, was to build a set of images and clips that conveyed balance, control, and calm in remote natural landscapes. The Daintree area offered exactly that: tropical backdrops, wildlife sightings, and rainforest access points where large animals could be observed at relatively close range. Mari had rented a compact sedan in Cairns and spent her first 2 days moving between Cape Tribulation, Mossman Gorge, and several roadside viewpoints. She had seen wildlife only at a key distance: wallabies near the undergrowth, and a brief sighting of a tree kangaroo across a clearing. Understandably, I think nothing in those early encounters had required her to adjust her behavior. The trail access point where the incident occurred sat along a narrow sealed road bordered by dense tropical vegetation and intermittent clearings where animals often foraged during daylight hours. Mari reached the trailhead in the early afternoon when light foot traffic had slowed and several vehicles were already parked along the gravel verge. A southern cassowary was visible near the tree line, approximately 80 feet from the road, foraging with its head angled toward the ground. Cassowaries are widely regarded as the most dangerous birds in the world. Adult southern cassowaries stand up to 6 feet tall and can weigh between 120 and 165 pounds, with powerful legs capable of delivering forward kicks of enormous force. Each foot carries a dagger-like inner claw, the cassowary's most dangerous feature, measuring up to 5 inches in length, capable of inflicting deep lacerating wounds to the torso, limbs, or neck in a single strike. I wouldn't want to be found near one. 2 occupants in a parked hatchback remained near their vehicle, watching. Another car slowed briefly before continuing past. Mari pulled in, angled her car toward the clearing, and stopped with the driver's side facing the bird. She exited quickly, leaving the door open, her phone already in her hand with the camera active. There were visible signs that should have established distance. A permanent trailhead notice warned visitors not to approach cassowaries and to maintain a minimum distance of at least 50 feet at all times. The bird itself showed early indicators, lifting its head, raising the bright wattles at its throat, and orienting its body toward her. The couple near the hatchback later told investigators that they assumed she would stop at the edge of the verge, but instead, she stepped off the packed gravel onto uneven ground, closing the distance to roughly 60 feet. She raised her phone, seemingly adjusting her position for a tighter frame. The cassowary turned fully to face her, casque tilting slightly forward. The nearby witnesses began calling out loudly, a short, repeated signal. Mari glanced back briefly and lifted one hand in a dismissive gesture before returning her attention to the animal. She moved closer again, stepping onto a shallow slope where loose gravel transitioned to leaf litter. The distance narrowed to approximately 25 to 30 feet. The bird's posture shifted further, neck extended, body lowered slightly, legs set in a more rigid stance. It took several short advancing steps toward her, closing a small portion of the distance, while maintaining its forward orientation. The calling increased in frequency. A passing hiker slowed and then stopped behind the couple, observing the scene. Mari adjusted her stance and raised her phone higher, positioning it as if preparing to frame herself with the cassowary behind her. It's really infuriating how she ignored all the warning signs. The charge began after a brief forward advance of several feet, the bird accelerating suddenly into a sprint. Mari reacted late, pivoting to run back toward the pavement. Her footing failed on the loose leaf litter. Her right foot slipped on the uneven slope, and she fell onto her side, impacting the ground with her shoulder and hip. She attempted to push herself upright, but the bird closed the remaining distance almost immediately. The first contact came from a forward kick, the inner claw raking across her upper abdomen and lower chest in a fast, upward motion. The force drove her flat against the ground. The impact produced a visible jolt through her body, after which her movements became less coordinated. She rolled partially onto her side, bringing her arms inward toward her head. The cassowary stepped past her and turned back toward her position, creating a brief gap of a few feet before re-engaging. The cassowary repositioned again, stepping laterally and then forward, delivering one more forceful forward kick that struck across her midsection in a broad, tearing motion. The inner claw caught briefly against her clothing and body before the leg retracted as the bird shifted its weight. The movement rotated her onto her back. Her legs extended outward without coordinated motion. Her attempts to move decreased noticeably after this point. At this point, the couple near the hatchback was shouting continuously. One was on the phone with emergency services, providing location details and reporting an active wildlife attack. The other moved closer to the road edge, waving their arms and calling out in an attempt to distract the animal. The cassowary remained focused for several seconds more, standing near her position with its head lowered, then stepped back, pivoted, and moved at a steady pace toward the tree. Line. Mari lay near the edge of the trailhead, partially on the gravel, partially on the leaf litter. There was minimal visible movement. The witnesses were instructed by emergency services to remain at a safe distance due to the risk of the cassowary returning. Considering the circumstances, I think it's commendable that they did what they could to try and save her. The call to emergency services was logged during the attack. Wildlife officers and paramedics were dispatched immediately. The first response unit arrived approximately 20 minutes after the initial call. During that interval, no one approached the victim. The cassowary did not return to the immediate area, but remained within the surrounding vegetation, according to later observation by wildlife staff. Upon arrival, responders assessed the scene for wildlife presence before approaching. Mari was unresponsive. There were multiple visible injuries across the torso and upper body. Paramedics initiated assessment procedures, but identified no signs of sustained responsiveness. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Based on the coroner's report, the cause of Mari's death was penetrating and blunt force trauma consistent with cassowary attack. Primary injuries included multiple deep lacerations to the torso, severe chest trauma, a collapsed lung, and internal hemorrhage from claw strikes. Additional trauma to the shoulder and pelvic regions was noted. The report concluded that the injuries were severe and life-threatening, with survival dependent on rapid medical intervention. The area was temporarily closed following the incident. Wildlife officers monitored the cassowary and surrounding zone for several days, noting continued normal foraging behavior consistent with established territorial patterns. No removal of the animal was carried out. Advisory signage was increased along the roadway, emphasizing minimum viewing distances and the extreme risk of approaching cassowaries under any circumstances. Mari's social media accounts were taken offline approximately 1 week later at the request of her family. Local coverage of the incident remained limited, appearing primarily in regional reports focused on wildlife safety. The trailhead where the attack occurred reopened after a brief closure, with additional warnings posted at the site. Overall, I think this was a good call, but I don't think it would stop other influencers from attempting to take selfies with a cassowary. It was the 28th of August, 2018. Masai Mara National Reserve, Kenya. The wildebeest migration was moving through its peak crossing season. Thousands of animals pushing across the Mara River, while crocodiles were present along the waterline, some partially visible, others not clearly distinguishable beneath the surface. The tour group was on an elevated bank with a clear sightline across the water. It was exactly the kind of scene James had come to document. James Carter was 38. He worked as a software engineer and had spent the better part of the previous year locked into a project cycle that had left him with almost no time for anything else. This trip was the break he had been promising himself. He had chosen the Mara specifically because of the migration crossing and had come prepared with camera equipment and a clear idea of the footage he wanted to bring back. He was the kind of person who approached things with precision and liked to get the result right. On the elevated bank, the angle felt too high and too distant for what he had in mind. I understand the instinct. He had planned this trip for a year, had specific footage in mind, and the angle from the designated spot was not what he wanted. But he didn't plan for what played out. He moved without telling anyone. While the group watched from the designated position, he slipped away and worked his way down to a lower point along the riverbank. 15 minutes passed before anyone noticed he was gone. The guide swept the area with binoculars and found him crouched low, camera extended, several meters below the group at the edge of the waterline. Crocodiles were present along the waterline in front of him, some partially visible, others not clearly distinguishable beneath the surface. He had been there a few minutes. Nothing had moved in that time. The stillness settled into something he read as safe enough. The water was calm. The light was good. He shifted his weight forward, bringing his legs closer to the waterline to improve the camera angle. The guide had already started making his way down the uneven slope and was shouting across the bank. James looked up, saw him, and waved. He held up a hand to signal he was fine and turned back to the camera. He did not move back from the edge. What James could not have known, and what the guide understood well, was that a Nile crocodile is capable of remaining motionless for hours and can cover several meters of ground in under a second when it commits to a lunge. The stillness was not a sign of disinterest. It was how they hunt. The guide was still picking his way down when the nearest crocodile moved. The nearest crocodile lunged from the shallows and seized him at the lower body before he had time to react or stand. The force knocked him forward and off balance. The crocodile dragged him toward the water. James went in at the edge. The grip did not release, and the force behind it was not something a person could pull against. By the time the guide reached the lower bank, James had already been pulled into the water and out of reach. He called emergency services immediately and remained at the bank, not entering the water until help arrived. Response to the location took time. When responders reached the scene, James Carter was confirmed dead. He was 38 years old. The coroner later recorded the cause of death as severe traumatic injuries, consistent with a crocodile attack. His camera was recovered from the scene. It contained no footage of the attack. He was laid to rest by his wife. His camera was recovered. It contained no footage of the attack. He had gone down there for a shot, and the camera caught none of it. I do not know why that detail lands the way it does, but it does every time I read it. It was June 14th, 2015, on a rented stretch of private beach outside Nassau, New Providence Island, the Bahamas, and the wedding was still in motion when something in the water changed the tone of everything happening on shore. Crispin Aldemar Voss, 31, was an HVAC technician from Asheville, North Carolina. He worked steadily, avoided attention, and followed routines. The destination wedding had been Britta's vision, and he had agreed without resistance. Britta Celine Haverkamp, 29, a dental hygienist, had spent nearly 2 years organizing the event. The photographer, Tomasz Wirecki, a Miami-based freelancer, suggested a final photo set in shallow water at sunset for lighting conditions. The resort allowed beach access without restriction. From the research I did, this kind of unrestricted shoreline access at resort properties in the Bahamas is pretty standard, and that context matters for what unfolds here. The shoreline was part of a managed coastal cove with clear, shallow water that gradually deepened into sand channels. This region is part of a wider Bahamian marine ecosystem, where coastal shark species occasionally move through reef edges, sand flats, and nearshore feeding areas while following prey movement patterns. The water was calm at the surface, with only light wave action breaking over the sandbar. Visibility was moderate, but reduced near the bottom due to stirred sediment from earlier movement in the shallows. Several guests were still waiting nearby, adding minor surface disturbance, while the couple remained stationary for photos as the photographer adjusted position closer to the waterline. Crispin stepped into chest-deep water. Britta followed, her dress floating in the current. Guests watched from the shoreline as the final poses were set. The incident occurred suddenly. Crispin's body shifted as an unseen force from below disrupted his balance and pulled him partially underwater. The movement was abrupt enough that nearby guests initially interpreted it as a slip or loss of footing in uneven sand. He he resurfaced disoriented, displacing water and struggling to orient himself before attempting to regain balance. A shark was briefly observed in close proximity in shallow water. Based on regional species presence and post-incident marine review, the most likely species involved was a bull shark, a coastal species documented in Bahamian nearshore environments and associated with severe bite incidents in shallow surf zones. Species identification could not be confirmed at the time of the incident. The interaction was consistent with a short bite and release event, a behavior documented in some coastal shark species where unfamiliar surface activity or rapid movement can trigger investigative contact rather than sustained predation. Immediately after the first contact, Crispin attempted to move toward shore but lost structural stability in the water due to injury, wave motion, and uneven footing within the sand channel. The resulting splashing and irregular movement were followed within seconds by additional close-range contact to the same lower limb, producing a more forceful injury and rapid escalation of tissue and vascular damage. Crispin remained conscious as Britta reached him. Several guests entered the water to assist, while others called for emergency help. The photographer moved toward shore as the situation escalated. Crispin was brought into shallower water by bystanders. He remained conscious for a short period, but showed rapid signs of severe blood loss from the lower body. His ability to stand collapsed as hemorrhage progressed. Britta was right there. I keep coming back to that. She was right there, and there was nothing she could do to change what was already happening. Emergency services arrived shortly after dispatch and performed hemorrhage control on scene, including a tourniquet, before rapid transport. He was airlifted to a hospital in Nassau for surgery, but died later that day from exsanguination due to severe lower limb vascular injury. Authorities classified it as a fatal marine injury during recreational shoreline activity. With no direct visual confirmation or recovered animal, the exact sequence and species could not be confirmed, though regional reviews suggested a likely interaction with a coastal bull shark. Limited footage briefly circulated before removal. The resort conducted an internal review and issued no public findings beyond standard reporting. Britta returned home days later, and the photographer left wedding work. No further statements were made. I know these kinds of incidents are rare, but they can still happen in coastal areas where humans and nearshore sharks overlap. I understand that awareness and caution in low visibility water can reduce risk, but it can't be fully eliminated. It was August 22nd, 2014. The Gulf of Mexico sat flat and hazy under a late summer sky. The heat had been building since early morning, pressing down on the water's surface in a way that made the horizon shimmer and blur. By midday, the conditions offshore were typical for the season. Warm water, low visibility beneath the surface, a faint current moving through the area without enough force to clear the suspended particulate that reduced underwater sightlines to a matter of feet. From above, the water looked calm and empty. Leonard Brooks was 41 years old, an experienced spearfisher who had been working the area for several hours. Over the course of the session, he had secured multiple fish to his body as he worked, a standard and practical approach to spearfishing that allows a diver to retain their catch without returning to the surface repeatedly. It is a common practice. It is also one that transforms the diver into a continuous and concentrated source of biological material dispersing into the surrounding water. Blood and fluid from the catch spread steadily outward into the current from his position. He had been in the water long enough for that trail to extend a significant distance in multiple directions. Leonard wasn't being reckless. He was doing exactly what experienced spearfishers do, but the water had been registering his presence for hours before anything happened. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous and least predictable shark species in the world. They are highly responsive to olfactory stimuli, capable of detecting extremely low concentrations of dissolved biological compounds in the water, and are known to range widely through both offshore and nearshore environments, including river systems and shallow coastal waters. They are not selective in the way that some shark species are. They are opportunistic, persistent, and highly reactive to the combination of scent and movement that a struggling or bleeding animal produces in the water. Unlike many shark species that make a single investigatory contact and withdraw to assess the result, bull sharks engage in escalating feeding behavior once sufficiently stimulated. When multiple individuals are present in the same area and the stimulus is strong and sustained, that escalation can become rapid, a compounding response driven by increased chemical and movement cues in the water, drawing more animals in and accelerating the pace of the response. Once that chain reaction starts with bull sharks, it doesn't slow down. The first bite wasn't the beginning of the danger. It was the end of any window to avoid it. The first contact came as a bite to the torso and arm. Investigatory, a shark assessing an unfamiliar object, but the wound changed the situation immediately. Blood entered the water directly from Leonard's body, compounding an already substantial scent trail. His movement in response generated exactly the erratic motion that amplifies a feeding response. A second animal arrived within minutes, then another. The escalation built rather than ignited, but once it was building, nothing interrupted it. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the sharks, the building. As Leonard became incapacitated, his orientation shifted, his body rising toward the surface, his head exposed as control collapsed. The facial injuries weren't deliberate, they were incidental, the result of repeated close-range contact once he had no position left to hold. With bull sharks, the window doesn't just close, it disappears. It was March 14th, 2018, on a 340-acre private compound outside Missoula. Cold and still in the early morning. The kind of quiet that comes from being far enough from everything that no outside sound reaches the property. Dale Crawford was 54 and had built a technology infrastructure company in Seattle into something large enough that a European consortium had spent 3 years trying to buy it, with a final investor meeting scheduled for that morning. He had moved to the Montana compound a few years earlier after regulatory scrutiny around his business. The property included multiple outbuildings, one of which had been constructed without permits and was not accurately listed in property records. That outbuilding housed a 5-year-old male lion named Aries. On paper, the animal was owned by a licensed exotic exhibitor, leasing space on the property under the Animal Welfare Act. In practice, Crawford had sourced the animal through brokers and made decisions about its care. The arrangement had not been recently inspected and did not meet proper separation standards. The caretaker, Roy Morrow, had reported for weeks that the enclosure latch was degrading and misaligned, weakened further by repeated pressure from the animal. 11 days before the meeting, a replacement part was ordered. In the meantime, a secondary chain and a consumer padlock were added. No additional restrictions were put in place around the enclosure. I want to be fair. I understand that people convince themselves things are handled. This was not handled. The meeting began at 10 a.m., with participants both on-site and remote. Catering activity in the main house carried noise and food scent outward. The lion returned to the weakened latch point, applied force, and the primary latch failed. The chain held briefly before the padlock housing fractured. The gate opened. The enclosure sat about 80 meters from the main house. The lion reached the structure in under a minute and entered through a service corridor door left open for catering. Inside, it moved toward the source of sound and activity, pausing briefly at the meeting room entrance before entering. It focused on movement, reached Dale Crawford, and took him to the ground before anyone could respond. The attack was rapid and forceful. One attendee attempting to exit was seriously injured, while another escaped through a side door. Remote participants witnessed the entry before the feed cut. Roy Morrow, already nearby due to repeated checks, saw the animal move toward the house and retrieved a dart rifle. He reached the scene within minutes. Emergency services had been called, but rural response time exceeded 30 minutes. A first dart slowed the animal, and a second was required. Full immobilization took additional time. Crawford was pronounced dead at the scene. The injured attendee was airlifted to hospital. The investigation cited violations of the Animal Welfare Act and related statutes. The unlicensed structure and prior maintenance reports were noted. A civil case followed. The acquisition collapsed under a morality clause, and the animal was later transferred to an accredited sanctuary. It was August 17th, 2015, and weak afternoon light filtered through the warped timber walls of a half-abandoned agricultural complex on the outskirts of Brașov, Romania. On this afternoon, it would become the last place Benny ever stood upright. Benjamin Benny Cordell was 28 years old, a construction worker from Oregon who had relocated to Eastern Europe. His YouTube channel had fewer than 50 subscribers. Those who had watched described his content as escalation-driven, fire endurance clips, controlled falls, and improvised stunts built more around shock value than structured training. It seemed to me like he treated danger as currency and warnings as noise. What Benny likely did not appreciate was the predator waiting at the far end of that barn. The bear brought in for the shoot was a 9-year-old male named Max, housed in a pen of welded scrap fencing and repurposed steel panels. Eurasian brown bears are the most widespread brown bear subspecies across Europe and Western Russia. Adult males commonly weigh between 550 and 770 pounds, dense with muscle, bone, and evolutionary precision. Their forelimbs can deliver bone-shattering force, and territorial aggression intensifies sharply with age. Max had been habituated to human presence during controlled feeding demonstrations, but never to uncontrolled proximity in an enclosed structure. The barn offered no reassurance, a single metal door that stuck when closed, gaps throughout the walls, no secondary barriers, no recognized safety standards. Dobre was the only person present who fully understood what any of that meant. Benny arrived with bear spray, but not for defense. He intended to coat himself in it, inspired by popular stunt videos. Dobre said that he warned him directly. Aerosol capsaicin in an enclosed space would affect everyone inside, and may have contributed to escalating the animal's reaction in unpredictable ways. Benny ignored the warning. The camera was running. Within minutes, he discharged the first canister over his jacket and arms, screaming and laughing as his friend recorded. The aerosol lingered in the still air, building into a visible haze. His friend began coughing, turning away from the lens. At the far end of the structure, Max began pacing. Short, low vocalizations, shifting quickly into repeated lunging at the barrier. Anchor bolts strained audibly against the steel posts. Dobre moved toward the enclosure to re-secure the lead, then hesitated as the chemical cloud thickened around him. Benny discharged a second canister. The fencing was not designed to absorb sustained impact. When Max broke through, the failure cascaded, one gate latch giving first, followed by anchor points, then welded panels collapsing in sequence. The distance closed in under seconds. The first contact drove Benny sideways into a timber support post that cracked on impact. He hit the ground before he could regain footing. What followed was not a single strike. There was a brief reorientation, a second surge forward, then repeated contact at close range. Dobre attempted to intervene with a metal pole, but was forced back by the collapsed fencing between him and the animal. His friend retreated to the far wall, weeping, and called emergency services from a mobile phone. By the time responders arrived, Benny Cordell was dead. Max had not attacked out of malice. He had responded, with everything evolution had given him, to chemical disorientation, confined space, and an uncontrolled human presence that had entered his territory without warning. The property was partially dismantled during an unrelated inspection sweep months afterward. The footage was seized by investigators during the initial inquiry and was never publicly released. Dobre was questioned but faced no formal charges. The informal network of private handlers through which Max had passed was never fully traced. Now, I have no sympathy to extend here. Benny was warned, clearly and more than once, by someone who actually knew what they were talking about. He ignored it because a camera was running. That is not bravery. That is the most ordinary kind of fatal stupidity there is. It was September 16, 2018, Gallatin National Forest, Montana. A canyon. Trail running through dense brush with rock walls rising on both sides. The terrain funneled movement in one direction and limited visibility to a short stretch ahead. Sound carried differently in the canyon depending on the wind. It was a known grizzly bear country, and both hikers knew that before they started. Aaron Whitfield was 39. He worked as a structural engineer for a firm in Bozeman and had been hiking seriously since his early 20s. He had introduced Jess to trail hiking not long after they met, and over the years she had grown comfortable on most terrain, though she still deferred to him on route decisions and gear. They had been married for 11 years. Their youngest daughter had just left for boarding school the previous month, the last of their children to go, and the house had been quieter than either of them had expected. The trip had been Aaron's suggestion, just the two of them, the way things had been before the children came. Jess had agreed without hesitation. Their youngest had just left for boarding school. The house was quiet for the first time in years. Aaron suggested the trip, and Jess agreed without hesitation. I keep thinking about how normal that sounds, how ordinary the reason for going was. Jess Whitfield was also 39. She worked as a practice manager at a dental clinic in Bozeman. Hiking was not something she had grown up with. Aaron had brought her into it gradually, and she had come to enjoy it, particularly the longer canyon routes, where the terrain felt dramatic without being technical. She trusted his judgment on the trail the way she trusted it most places. They had come prepared. bear spray was clipped to both hip holsters with the safety tabs already removed. They were moving at a controlled pace and making regular noise as they walked. Everything about their approach to the trail was correct. The grizzly appeared ahead of them at roughly 60 meters. Both hikers stopped immediately. They stood together, spoke in calm, steady voices, and held the spray at low ready. The bear was watching them and beginning to close the distance slowly. They held their position and kept talking. The bear continued to approach. As the distance came down to around 30 meters, Aaron shifted slightly forward. The adjustment placed him closer to the bear than Jess. He was now the nearest point of contact. The bear closed the remaining distance rapidly. Aaron deployed the spray. The cloud caught the edge of the approach and disrupted the bear's focus, but not enough to stop the charge at that distance. The bear reached Aaron. It bit into his upper back and neck and pinned him under its weight, maintaining contact through repeated force. The injuries were severe and rapidly incapacitating. A ranger already in the canyon corridor, moving through the trail system after recent bear activity reports in the area, changed direction when human voices shifted from routine noise to distress. Coming into a position. With sightlines to the trail, the ranger deployed bear spray from a distance that allowed the cloud to form fully. The secondary spray cloud reached effective concentration across the trail before the bear could re-engage with Jess. The bear disengaged and redirected away from her and out of the immediate area. The ranger got on the radio immediately and called for additional personnel and emergency medical response. Jess was kept back while the ranger moved toward Aaron. He was on the ground in the encounter zone, unresponsive, with severe injuries to his neck and upper back. The ranger attempted to control the bleeding as best as the injury location allowed and maintained that until additional personnel arrived. Paramedics were dispatched, but the canyon location added time to the response. By the time medical support reached the scene, Aaron Whitfield had lost too much blood. He was pronounced dead at the site. He was 39 years old. Jess was uninjured. Post-incident review noted that both hikers had followed correct bear encounter protocol from the initial sighting. It was the morning of July 29, 2017, along a narrow channel in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, where the water moved slowly between walls of papyrus and the air smelled of mud and reeds. The channel was quiet. The surface was still. Nothing visible suggested any danger. That stillness is part of what makes the Delta so disarming. Priya Sharma, 29, was a travel vlogger from Mumbai, India, with a growing YouTube channel focused on solo female travel. She had approximately 22,000 subscribers and was building a series on destinations in sub-Saharan Africa. She was organized and detail-oriented in her planning, but she had no experience with crocodile habitats and had not researched the specific risks of Mokoro travel in the Delta. That gap between general preparation and specific knowledge is something I come back to often in these cases. Priya had planned the trip carefully, booked a reputable guide, and done the work. But she had not understood what the Delta specifically required of her, and that specific gap was the one that mattered. Her guide was a local operator named Kabo Sital, 44, who had been running Mokoro tours in the Delta for over a decade. Kabo gave the same briefing every morning. Stay seated, keep hands and arms inside the canoe. At all times, do not lean toward the water. He explained that Nile crocodiles in the Delta were not always visible and could approach from directly below the surface. Priya had been filming throughout the trip, holding her camera over the side of the Mokoro to capture low-angle footage. Kabo had corrected her twice on the first day. She adjusted briefly each time, then returned to the same position. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely difficult to understand. The warning had been given clearly, more than once, and the reason behind it was explained, and yet the habit continued. I think there is something about calm water that makes people feel safe in a way that open savanna does not, and that false sense of calm is exactly what makes crocodile habitats so consistently deadly. A lion on the plains is visible. Nile crocodiles are ambush predators that wait submerged with only their eyes and nostrils above the waterline, detecting movement through vibration in the water before striking upward with explosive speed. An adult Nile crocodile can reach 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,500 pounds, with a bite force among the strongest of any living animal. What makes them particularly lethal is not the initial strike, it is what comes after. On the morning of July 29th, Priya was filming a slow pan across the water surface, leaning forward with her camera extended over the side of the Mokoro. Cabo told her to sit back. She held up a hand and continued filming. The crocodile had been stationary beneath the surface, less than 30 feet from the canoe. The strike came from below. The animal lunged upward and seized her right arm just below the elbow, pulling her forward and partially out of the Mokoro. Cabo grabbed her left arm with both hands and pulled hard. For a moment, there was a struggle. Priya partially in the water, Cabo pulling from one side, the crocodile from the other. He was fighting with everything he had. The crocodile began to roll. The torque broke Cabo's grip. Priya went into the water. Cabo used the paddle to strike the surface repeatedly, but the crocodile had already submerged with her. The channel went still within seconds. The same stillness that had been there all morning returned as if nothing had happened. A response team arrived approximately 2 hours later. Priya's camera was recovered, floating near the reeds. Her body was found the following morning, partially submerged beneath a root system roughly a quarter-mile downstream. Post-mortem findings confirmed death by drowning, with significant trauma to the right arm and shoulder. The medical examiner noted that drowning was the primary cause. She had been held underwater, not killed by the initial strike. Cabo was cleared of negligence. He had given the warning, repeated it, and when the moment came, he had held on until the physics of the situation took that option away from him. Priya's family was notified through the Indian consulate. Her final video, uploaded 2 days before the incident, showed her boarding the Mokoro at sunrise, describing the delta as the most peaceful place she had ever been. She was not wrong about the beauty of it. She just did not know what was underneath it. It was January 14th, 2014, and the cramped chicken coop on the outskirts of Kampong Cham felt smaller than ever, the low ceiling forcing anyone inside to crouch while moving. That night, a massive Burmese python had already made its way into space, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Sokum Dara, 51, had spent decades building his small farm, raising chickens for both his family and extra income. He was a careful man, known for tending his birds meticulously. Lately, though, 6 chickens had gone missing, and Dara's frustration grew. He decided to stay overnight in the coop, hoping to catch the culprit. At first, Dara assumed the thief was a human. He imagined a neighbor or passerby sneaking in under cover of night to take his chickens, thinking about the footprints he might see or the shadows he might catch. I can picture him sitting there, crouched among the chickens, flashlight in hand, legs cramping, thinking he's ready for whatever comes, but not knowing what's really waiting. The coop was tiny, only 8 by 12 feet. Every corner was within reach, leaving little room to dodge anything large. Burmese pythons can reach 16 feet in length and weigh over 160 pounds. Their strength is terrifying. They can crush ribs and stop blood flow in minutes. In confined spaces, they use every surface for leverage. Dara probably thought he was in control, but the space gave the snake the upper hand. I keep thinking about how claustrophobic that must have felt. Walls so close that every move became a risk. Earlier signs should have warned him. Villagers had talked about increased python activity after the seasonal flooding, and a neighbor had found a large shed skin nearby. Chickens were acting stressed, squawking at night, huddling unnaturally. I can almost hear that frantic clucking echoing in my head, like a warning he didn't fully understand. Around midnight, the chickens erupted into chaos. Dara's flashlight illuminated the massive python coiled around one of his hens. Startled, he lunged to save. The bird slipped on the damp floor and fell directly into the snake's striking range. The serpent uncoiled and struck, wrapping firm coils around Dara's torso while pinning his left arm. The python wasn't immediately crushing him, but each struggle only made it tighten further. I hate imagining the helplessness, trying to push it away, feeling it adjust and brace itself, realizing nothing you do loosens its grip. Every movement gave the snake more leverage. Its muscles worked like a machine, tightening around Dara's chest and abdomen, then looping around his legs. The cramped coop meant he couldn't twist or get proper footing. Breathing became shallow, each gasp weak and muffled. I can feel the panic imagining it, pressure crushing your ribs, arms pinned, and the ground slippery beneath you. Within minutes, he lost consciousness as the pressure around his chest restricted breathing and circulation. The next morning, a neighbor noticed the unusual silence and discovered Dara's body still wrapped in the python's coils. Authorities arrived about 30 minutes later, finding the snake had moved to a corner but remained in the coop. The examination showed multiple rib fractures and internal injuries consistent with prolonged constriction and asphyxiation. asphyxiation. He was later pronounced dead from complications of his injuries. The python was nearly 17 feet long and was later relocated by wildlife officials. After Dara's death, neighboring farmers reinforced their coops and improved safety measures. His family eventually sold the property and moved closer to town. The incident became a cautionary tale, though little concrete action was taken beyond the immediate village. I keep thinking about that moment in the coop, how tiny it was. Dara didn't expect a python that large, and the confined space made escape impossible. It's hard not to feel the situation could have been avoided if he hadn't gone in, alone that night. The signs were there, the risk obvious, but I guess sometimes pride and worry about your livelihood make you take chances you shouldn't. I can't say it was careless. It was human, but yeah, this one was preventable. It was Friday, July 5th, 2018, in Tucson, Arizona. The sun was setting over the desert and the air was very hot. Inside a small apartment, the air conditioner was humming. Ashley Marco was 24 years old. She was a person who loved reptiles more than anything else. She had a TikTok account with about 3,400 followers. She spent most of her time filming her snakes. Ashley had 14 snakes in her apartment. She had ball pythons, corn snakes, and a beautiful rainbow boa. She had a tattoo on her arm of a king cobra. She called the tattoo the crown. Most of her snakes were not venomous. This means their bite would hurt, but it would not kill you, because she handled these snakes every day. She became very brave. I want to say something here. 14 snakes, and not one of them had ever seriously hurt her. That kind of track record will make anyone feel untouchable. She would hold them with her bare hands while the camera was recording. For many months, Ashley had a dream. She wanted a king cobra. This was the snake she had always wanted. King cobras are known for being highly reactive and difficult to handle safely. Finally, she found a seller. She paid $1,800 for a young male king cobra. It was about 5 feet long. Ashley was at a pool party with her friends when she got a message. The snake had arrived at her home. She was so excited that she left the party immediately. She drove home fast. She wanted to show the world her new snake. Keeping venomous snakes legally in Arizona can involve permits and local restrictions. The snake was sent to her in a box. It traveled for 18 hours. During this time, the snake was tossed around in a dark box. It was stressed from the travel. In her older videos, Ashley told her fans that you should never touch a venomous snake right after it arrives. She said they need days to calm down. But on this Friday, she did not follow her own advice. Ashley did not have an emergency plan. She only had her phone and her ring light. At 9:42 p.m., she turned on her live stream. About 61 people joined to watch. She was smiling and full of energy. She set up her phone so everyone could see the enclosure. She talked about how happy she was. Then, she opened the shipping container. As soon as the lid opened, the cobra emerged and stood up. It spread its wide hood and stayed in a defensive position. Ashley did not move back. She used a metal hook to move the snake, but she stayed very close. She told her viewers that the snake was just being spicy. In the chat, people started to get worried. They typed messages asking her to be careful. Ashley laughed it off. 61 people watching her laugh off a king cobra strike. I genuinely didn't know whether to be more stunned by the bite or by what she did right after. As she adjusted the hook and shifted her attention toward the live stream comments, the cobra rotated suddenly and struck before she could reposition safely. The cobra bit her on the base of her left thumb. Ashley jumped back and made a sharp sound. She quickly put the snake back in its cage and closed the door. She picked up a towel she had brought from the pool party and wrapped it around her hand. She looked at the camera and tried to act like it was no big deal. She laughed nervously and told the stream she had probably just been tagged. She checked the bite. It was not swelling much. She told her followers it might be a dry bite. A dry bite is when a snake bites, but chooses not to use its venom. Venom is expensive for a snake to make, so they sometimes save it for their food instead of using it for defense. She continued talking to the live stream for several more minutes, trying to stay calm for her audience. At first, Ashley thought she had gotten lucky, but over the next 20 to 30 minutes, she started sweating heavily. Her jaw felt strange. Then her eyelids became difficult to keep open. This type of venom is called a neurotoxin. It attacks the nerves and tells the muscles to stop working. Her words became slow and blurry. She tried to stand up, but her legs felt like jelly. she sat back down heavily. The people watching the live stream knew something was wrong. They urged her to call 911 immediately. Ashley kept insisting she could still breathe. One viewer contacted emergency dispatch in Tucson, but nobody knew her exact apartment number. This caused a delay while responders tried to find her. On the screen, Ashley was struggling for air. It felt like a heavy weight was sitting on her chest. When the paramedics finally arrived, the ring light was still on. They found Ashley on the floor. By the time she reached the hospital, she was in severe respiratory failure. Doctors placed her on a ventilator to help her breathe. Poison control specialists worked to find king cobra anti-venom from exotic animal networks and zoos. Because king cobras are from Asia, the medicine was not easy to find nearby. By the time anti-venom arrangements were underway, the venom had already caused severe respiratory paralysis. Ashley Marco died early the next morning. She was 24 years old. The cause of death was recorded as fatal neurotoxic envenomation. The next day, wildlife authorities came to the apartment. They took the king cobra and the other snakes away. Investigators later examined whether she had the required permits and authorizations to keep the cobra. Footage of the incident was removed to discourage people from doing such stunts. It was May 22, 2017. The wet season had settled into its rhythm. Dense, saturated air over the river margins. The forest holding water in every surface. The afternoons building toward rain that arrived with the regularity of something scheduled. In the smaller communities along the river roads of Pará State, where houses sit close to the tree line, and the distance between one family's life and another's is measured in sounds through open windows, the ordinary has a texture that is different from anywhere else. Adriano Correa was 43 years old. He was a smallholder farmer growing manioc and maize on a plot cleared from the forest margin over more than a decade, supplemented by seasonal work on larger farms in the region. His wife Sylvia managed the household and ran a small, informal trade in goods that served the immediate neighborhood, sharper and more forward-looking than Adriano, the one who knew what things cost and what they were worth. His daughter Beatrice was 12, already developing her mother's watchfulness, and his son Gabriel was 9 and had his father's temperament, easy, unhurried, slow to alarm. He had raised the jaguar from a cub after it was found, orphaned near the property's edge 6 years earlier. He kept it in a reinforced enclosure at the rear of the property, never reported it, never registered it. Jaguars are the largest cat in the Western Hemisphere, and pound for pound carry the most powerful bite of any large cat, powerful enough to pierce skull or spine directly. Unlike lions or tigers, which kill through suffocation or blood loss, jaguars deliver a single precision bite to the head or neck designed to end the encounter. Immediately, an anatomy built not for sustained aggression, but for finality. Over 6 years, Adriano had developed a daily familiarity with the animal that made a 200-pound apex predator feel, across the distance of enough ordinary mornings, like something manageable. The jaguar had been part of the children's lives for as long as either of them could meaningfully remember. Beatrice had been 6 when it arrived, Gabriel 3, ages at which an animal becomes simply part of the world rather than an addition to it. For them, the enclosure at the back of the property was as ordinary as the manioc plot or the water tank, and the jaguar inside it carried the same quality of background familiarity as anything else that had always been there. On the morning of May 22nd, Sylvia was in the doorway of the enclosure outbuilding, and both children were behind her when Adriano went in to feed. The children watching was not unusual. Nothing in 6 years had given any of them a reason to. Recalibrate that. What none of them had registered was the quality of the jaguar's attention from the moment Adriano entered, a compression of focus, a specific stillness that trained observers distinguish from simple hunger. It was not visible to a family for whom the animal had been a fixture long enough that the signals had stopped carrying individual meaning. The attack came quickly. Adriano went down. Sylvia reached the enclosure gate and could not enter. The animal was between her and her husband, and entering that space without a weapon was not intervention, it was addition. She stood at the gate and kept calling his name, which is what people do when the only thing they have left is sound. Beatrice ran for the nearest neighbor. Gabriel stood in the doorway and did not move. It is what 9-year-old children do when they watch something their brain has no category for. By the time the neighbor arrived and the firearm was retrieved, the outcome had already been determined. Adriano Correa died in the enclosure he had built, with his family present, from an animal he had raised from the first weeks of its life. No registration, no permit, no record of the animal's existence in any official system, and no evidence that any of those absences had ever felt like a gap to the family living around it. What the investigation could not document, because investigations are not built for it, is what Sylvia carried out of that morning beyond the loss itself. The specific weight of having stood at a gate with nothing left to offer, of having called a name into a space she could not enter. That particular shape of helplessness does not resolve. It changes over time into something people learn to carry rather than something they set down. Hey, I'm Christopher, and today I'm about to explore fatal animal attacks that killed stupid influencers. From influencers who laughed at their guide and were mauled seconds later, to a content creator who walked towards a cassowary for a selfie, ending her career in the dumbest way ever. It was August 14th, 2018. The northern sector of Kruger National Park lay under a dry, colorless sky when the stillness of a routine safari drive collapsed into a sequence of impacts. Leoran Vasca, known online as Leo, was 27 and had a small following built on low-budget travel across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. He worked intermittently as a warehouse packer in Riga, saving for trips he framed as spontaneous and unscripted. Friends said he chased moments that could drive engagement, close calls, rule bending, anything that felt raw. His content relied less on expertise and more on proximity to risk and his willingness to dismiss it. He was traveling through South Africa with two acquaintances from a backpacking forum, Darvin Ilko, 25, from Bulgaria, and Simao Carrick, 29, from Portugal. Both ran small social media pages and shared Leo's approach to filming, often pushing each other to escalate situations for better footage. None had prior safari experience. Their guide, Mandla Nkub, had over a decade in the park and a reputation for strict safety. I think it was smart of them to hire an experienced guide. But knowing how this story ends, this detail makes this incident even more infuriating. By late morning, the group had seen little beyond distant herds and scattered antelope. According to Mandla, the monotony began to affect the passengers. Leo started filming from the back seat, narrating in a mocking tone about the lack of action. Darvin and Simao contributed intermittently, adding commentary and laughter. Mandla reminded them more than once to remain seated and to keep limbs inside the vehicle, emphasizing that proximity to wildlife did not equate to safety. I commend Mandla's patience. Personally, I would have dropped the gig then and there. He said that his instructions were acknowledged, but not followed consistently. Approximately an hour into the drive, they encountered a small grouping of elephants crossing the road ahead. A large bull stood several yards apart from the others, angled toward the vehicle. African bush elephants in this region are no joke. They can exceed 10 feet at the shoulder and weigh over 13,000 pounds, with mature bulls displaying unpredictable defensive behavior when separated from herds. Behavioral cues preceding a charge often include ear spreading, head elevation, and trunk curling inward, though these signals can escalate rapidly without prolonged display. Mandla immediately reduced speed and instructed the group to remain still and quiet. The tone inside the vehicle did not change. Leo continued filming, shifting his body for a clearer angle. He leaned his upper body out through the open side of the vehicle, extending past the frame while keeping one hand braced inside. Darvin leaned toward him to capture a similar shot, both of them focusing on the bull. Mandla's voice sharpened, directing Leo to sit down immediately. The instruction was repeated twice. Leo remained partially outside the vehicle, camera held forward. The bull elephant turned fully toward the vehicle, ears extending outward, trunk curling and uncurling in short movements. Dust lifted around its feet as it shifted its weight. The distance between the animal and the Jeep was under 40 yards. Just imagining the scene feels extremely terrifying. The charge began without further warning. The elephant accelerated directly toward the front left side of the vehicle, covering the distance in seconds. Witnesses in a trailing safari truck later described a sudden plume of dust and a rapid closing of space that left no time for repositioning. Mandla attempted to accelerate and angle the vehicle away, but the loose ground and proximity of the elephant prevented any meaningful movement. The impact was immediate. The elephant struck the Jeep's front left side, crushing metal and shoving it sideways. Leo, already off balance, was thrown about 6 feet from the vehicle, landing hard on his left side as his phone slid underneath. Inside, Darvin hit the side rail head first. Simao was pinned under the shifted seat, and Mandla was forced into the steering column with his lower body trapped. The elephant reached Leo within seconds. It struck him across the torso with its trunk, driving him into the ground. As he tried to pull himself forward, it brought a forefoot down onto his lower body, pinning him completely. Considering the weight of an average elephant, there's really no escaping death after being trampled by this massive animal. The animal lifted its foot briefly and repositioned. A second downward force was applied higher along the body, compressing the chest. Movement from Leo ceased at that point. The elephant remained over him for several seconds, shifting weight and pressing down again before stepping back. Dust hung in the air, partially obscuring visibility from the trailing vehicle. Inside the Jeep, Darvin was conscious, but disoriented, with visible bleeding from the scalp and limited ability to sit upright. Simao was similarly conscious, but unable to reposition himself due to compression against the seat frame. The fact that both remained conscious was actually surprising for me. Mandla, despite a visibly dislocated shoulder and his leg trapped beneath the dashboard, attempted repeatedly to restart the engine. He said his movements were uncoordinated and likely slowed by shock, and he was unable to regain control of the vehicle. The elephant turned its attention briefly toward the vehicle again, stepping closer before pausing. It faced the Jeep for several seconds, trunk moving across the ground near Leo's body before slowly backing away while maintaining orientation toward the disturbance. The distance increased gradually as the animal rejoined the direction of the herd. Mandla reached for the radio with his uninjured arm and initiated a call to park authorities. His transmission was fragmented, requiring multiple attempts to relay coordinates due to breath instability and pain. The trailing safari vehicle, positioned approximately 60 yards behind, had halted at the onset of the charge. Its occupants did not approach during the immediate aftermath due to the elephant's proximity. Within the disabled Jeep, Darvin's condition began to deteriorate. His responsiveness decreased, and his breathing became irregular. Simao remained intermittently conscious, but was unable to communicate clearly. Mandla continued attempting to stabilize the situation while maintaining radio contact. No one exited the vehicle. What's saddening for me is that the Rangers arrived approximately 22 minutes after the initial call. By that time, Leo showed no signs of life. Darvin had lost responsiveness during the final minutes before arrival. Simao was still alive, but unresponsive to verbal prompts and exhibiting shallow breathing. Extraction was conducted under controlled conditions once the area was confirmed clear of the elephant. All 3 victims were transported toward the nearest medical facility. Darvin was declared dead during transport after cardiac arrest approximately 10 minutes into evacuation. Simao's condition declined rapidly. He was pronounced dead shortly before arrival. Mandla was extracted alive, but with severe injuries, including a fractured leg and shoulder dislocation that limited mobility. Leo's and his friends' social media accounts remained active for several days before going silent and were eventually taken down by someone. But for me, the most frustrating part of this story isn't even who died. It's the situation of the survivor afterwards. Mandla underwent medical evaluation that confirmed long-term impairment to his leg and limited range of motion in his shoulder. He could not return to field guiding following the incident. His livelihood and future were just gone in an instant. It was January 14th, 2017. The South African winter had kept the morning gray and cold off the southern coast. The ocean sat dark and choppy, a heavy swell running under an overcast sky that offered no warmth and little light. The water temperature was low, cold enough to be felt immediately through a wetsuit, and the visibility beneath the surface was limited by the chop and the particulate that the swell stirred up from depth. From the boat, the water looked impenetrable, its surface broken and restless, giving nothing away about what moved below it. Active chumming had been underway for several hours at the dive site. Multiple great white sharks had been circling the area for some time, their dorsal fins cutting the surface at intervals as they moved through the chum slick in long, slow passes. The operation was running as intended. The sharks were present, they were active, and they were getting closer. And that's exactly what people pay for. The proximity is the attraction. The same setup that makes cage diving work is the same setup that made what happened next possible. Marcus Hill was 35 years old, participating in the cage dive operation at the site. The cage was positioned close to where the bait was suspended, a deliberate arrangement intended to bring the sharks within close viewing distance of the divers inside. The cage was doing what cages are designed to do, placing a barrier between the divers and the animals while allowing close observation. What cage dive operations cannot fully account for is the behavior of an animal moving at speed toward a target in close proximity to a metal structure. The cage works until it doesn't, and the variable it can't account for isn't equipment failure, it's physics. Mass and momentum don't negotiate with steel. Great white sharks are the largest predatory fish on Earth. Adult individuals commonly exceed 15 feet in length and 2,500 pounds, with larger specimens recorded well beyond those figures in the waters off the southern African coast. Bite force is estimated to be among the highest of any predatory fish, generated through massive jaw musculature and serrated dentition. Great whites are not indiscriminate feeders. They typically employ a bite and release strategy when encountering unfamiliar objects, a single powerful strike followed by withdrawal, during which the animal assesses whether the target is worth pursuing further. That initial bite, however, is not a cautious or restrained action. It is delivered at full force because the strike is driven by momentum and mass, with no ability for fine motor control during impact. At full force, a single bite from a great white is capable of causing catastrophic, unsurvivable trauma in a fraction of a second. In rare but documented cases during cage dive operations, sharks have partially entered cage structures during high-speed approaches toward bait, the animal's momentum carrying it into the metal framework before it can redirect, the cage shuddering and shifting violently under the impact of an animal of that mass moving at that velocity. A large, great white made a high-speed approach toward the bait suspended near the cage. The speed of the approach did not allow for course correction. The shark's momentum carried it directly into the cage structure. The impact was sufficient to displace the cage. A sudden, violent lurch that threw Marcus against the bars and partially out of the cage opening at the top. The shark's pass, still carrying full momentum through and past the cage, brought it into direct contact with Marcus at the moment he was no longer fully inside the structure. The bite was not directed at Marcus. It was directed at nothing. It was the terminal point of a high-speed approach that had already committed before any contact occurred. He was simply at the intersection of the animal's trajectory and the displacement the impact had caused. The bite and release mechanism meant the shark did not maintain contact. It struck and it withdrew, but the strike alone, in that position, at that force, was sufficient. The injury was not the product of targeted predatory behavior directed at Marcus specifically. It was the direct and unavoidable consequence of the shark's momentum, the physics of a large animal striking a suspended metal structure, and the position Marcus occupied in the fraction of a second that followed. He was inside the safety system, exactly where he was supposed to be, until the safety system moved, and he moved with it. It still wasn't enough. Not because of a mistake, because the margin was narrower than anyone on that boat realized. It was July 27th, 2017, at a tidal creek camp in the Sundarbans Delta, India, where huts stood on raised platforms linked by wooden boardwalks, and the mangrove forest began roughly 3 meters from the perimeter. Guests were briefed on arrival. No leaving the boardwalk alone, no movement before sunrise. Martin Ellsworth was 58 and worked as a commercial property developer in Bristol. He and his wife Caroline had been drifting for years, the marriage reduced to routine and distance. She had proposed the trip in an attempt to repair things. He had agreed after initial resistance, and they cleared a week to travel together. They were 4 days into the stay, with a small group, and the trip had not shifted the dynamic between them. The tension had followed them into the camp. In the early hours of July 27th, before dawn, Caroline looked at Martin's phone and found messages from his personal assistant. The exchange was clear enough. The argument that followed stayed quiet, contained within the hut while others slept. Martin did not deny it directly. The conversation ended without resolution. She brought him to the Sundarbans to save her marriage. I want you to hold on to that before we go any further. At approximately 5:15 a.m., in low light before sunrise, Martin took his cigarettes and left the hut without speaking. He had used the boardwalk alone during the day on previous occasions, and once stepped briefly off the end without consequence. The space within the perimeter had begun to feel controlled. He walked the length of the boardwalk and stepped off at the far end. Beyond it, the ground shifted to tidal mud, interlaced with mangrove roots. Visibility dropped within a few steps. Sound was dampened by the density of the vegetation. He moved several meters into the margin at the tree line. Bengal tigers and the Sundarbans use these root systems as movement corridors, holding position close to the boundary between open ground and forest. A tiger was already there, within close range before Martin entered the space. The encounter was not pursuit, it was overlap. The strike came from the left, fast and without warning. Contact was made at the neck and upper shoulder, and the force carried him into the roots. The tiger repositioned him further into the tree line and dragged him several meters toward cover before disengaging. Guests in nearby huts heard a single heavy impact, a brief disturbance in the roots, and then silence. Torches came on. People moved to the edge of the boardwalk, but did not enter the tree line. By then, the tiger had already withdrawn into the mangroves. Rangers were contacted, and a recovery team entered after first light, once the area was assessed for movement. Martin was located approximately 6 to 8 meters inside the tree line, near a dense root cluster. The injuries were non-survivable at the point of contact. His body was transported to the nearest ranger station, where Caroline identified him. The post-incident review confirmed he had left the boardwalk before sunrise against explicit instruction. The presence of the tiger at that location was consistent with normal movement patterns along the creek edge. No action was taken against the animal. The camp boundary ended at the boardwalk. He moved beyond it. It was July 9th, 2016, along a gravel pull-off on the Denali Highway, mile marker 118, where the asphalt gives way to raw Alaska and the tree line swallows everything that moves. Brock Marin, 34, spent most of his off time in Wasilla watching football and tinkering with small engines. The camping trip had been his girlfriend Dara's idea. She'd grown up in rural Montana and had pushed for it repeatedly. Brock had no prior camping experience, owned no outdoor gear, and had purchased the bear spray the morning they left, still in the cardboard packaging when they pitched the tent. He seems like a pushover to me. A black bear had been working the tree line adjacent to the campsite for at least 20 minutes before the incident. American black bears in interior Alaska are not the timid garbage raiders of the lower 48. Adult males in this region regularly exceed 400 pounds, sustained by dense summer foraging. They are fast over short ground, capable of 25 miles per hour across rough terrain, and when agitated, their behavior escalates with little transition between curious and aggressive. They are not naturally predatory toward humans, but they respond to sudden movement, unfamiliar scent, and perceived threat with speed that most people are cognitively unprepared to process. Dara's small mixed-breed dog, tied to a stake near the fire ring, began barking and then broke its lead. The bear gave chase. Neither Brock nor Dara retreated to their truck, which was 40 feet away. Dara moved toward the passenger door, but stopped when Brock turned toward the animal. A hiker named Petrov, camped roughly 60 yards down the pull-off with a clear sightline, later told rangers he had watched the bear circling the campsite for several minutes before the dog bolted and had been preparing to call out a warning. Brock grabbed the bear spray canister from the picnic table. He ripped off the safety clip, but instead of properly aiming it, he overhand threw the canister toward the bear like a makeshift grenade. It struck the animal near the left shoulder and dropped into the brush. At this point, as I read through the story, I'm facepalming in real time. The bear halted its pursuit of the dog. It turned toward Brock. Petrov later described a brief, unnatural stillness before it lowered its head and began advancing in a direct, steady line, closing distance with deliberate pressure before dropping fully into motion. Brock ran toward the truck, but the terrain was uneven, wet from the previous night's rain. He slipped and went down hard on his left knee within the first 10 feet. He did not get back up before the bear reached him. Dara, now inside the truck, reported hearing the impact, a sound she described to rangers as similar to something being dropped from height onto wet ground. The bear first used its forepaws, knocking Brock off balance and collapsing his left side as he fell back into the ground cover. He tried to curl away, but the animal followed immediately, switching from swats to a bite aimed at his upper torso, shaking him. The combination of force and weight did most of the damage in seconds, leaving him unable to move or respond. Petrov, who remained at distance, said the attack continued for what he estimated was between 90 seconds and 2 minutes before the bear disengaged and moved back into the brush. Brock was non-responsive before it left. Petrov activated his satellite communicator, and rangers reached the site moments later, only pronouncing death on sight. The coroner's report noted blunt force and lacerating trauma to the thoracic cavity, left arm, and neck consistent with bear attack. Cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, secondary to multiple deep lacerations and crush injury. Time of death was estimated within minutes of the attack. Wildlife officers flagged the incident under improper deterrent use. The bear was never located. I think Brock was not a reckless man. He was simply a man handed a tool he had never been shown how to use in a situation he had never been trained to assess. That gap is the tragedy here. Not stupidity, but genuine unpreparedness, treated as a minor detail, right up until it wasn't. It was September 17th, 2016, northwestern Montana. Black Rock Canyon Trail cuts through dense forested canyon country, known for grizzly bear activity. Trees pressed in on both sides, and the creek bed below the embankment kept visibility short in every direction. Daniel Forsyth was 46. He worked as a civil engineer. Friends described him as someone who was hard to reason with once he had made up his mind. He had been hiking for over 2 decades and believed he knew how to handle himself in the backcountry. He had the gear and the experience, and he trusted both completely. Ruth Forsyth was 44. She worked as a primary school teacher. She had been married to Daniel for 18 years, and the last 14 months had been the hardest. They had stopped talking the way they used to. Small disagreements dragged on longer than they should. Daniel had pulled away from her, and the more she tried to close the distance, the further he went. She had started to wonder whether what they had could still be saved. The trip was her idea. She suggested the trail, and he agreed almost before she finished asking, faster than he had agreed to anything in over a year. That yes meant something to her. They had met on this trail 19 years earlier and got engaged a year after that at a spot just past mile marker 6, where the canyon opened up and the view down the creek stayed with you. They had come back 11 times since. I think about that a lot. She was trying to save her marriage, and that was the trail she picked. The advisory board at the trailhead was clear. Multiple grizzly bears had been confirmed active between mile markers 6 and 9. Feeding had been observed along the creek corridor below mile marker 6, where bears had been drawn to a seasonal food source in that drainage. Hikers were told to turn back at mile marker 5. The warning was current and written in plain language. Daniel read it. Ruth stood beside him and watched him do it. When he finished, she told him it said to turn back at 5. He said they had done this trail 11 times and nothing had ever happened. He had his bear spray. The place they were going was past 6, right where the canyon opened up, the exact spot where he had proposed. He wanted to get there. Ruth told him again the warning was specific. He was already walking. She had not pushed back on him in a long time, and this did not feel like the moment to start. She followed. They crossed mile marker 5 at 9:25 in the morning. The trail got narrower and the brush got thicker on both sides. The creek ran below a short embankment to their left, and the vegetation cut visibility down to just a few meters. The sounds of the canyon, birds and water and wind, faded out in the stretch between the embankment and the tree line above the trail. Neither of them noticed. Daniel caught his foot on a root and glanced down for a moment. What they could not see was that 2 adult bears had been moving through the same creek feeding corridor independently, one working below the embankment to their left and one somewhere in the tree line to the right. The trail ran straight through the middle of that corridor. By the time they entered that stretch, there was no safe distance left in any direction. The bear from the embankment came up fast and hit Daniel from the left side. The force knocked him off the trail and onto the ground. The bear was on him immediately, biting hard into his upper back and neck. Ruth heard him go down and spun toward the sound. She stumbled to the right side of the trail, screaming and calling his name, trying to see him through the brush. That movement and that noise reached the second bear before she did. It had been feeding in the tree line above the trail, and her sudden lateral movement toward it closed the distance faster than either of them could have registered. She got the bear spray up, but she was off balance and pointing the wrong way. The spray went out at the wrong angle and did not build up where it needed to before the bear reached her. It bit into her upper back and neck. She went down and did not get up. The trail went quiet again after. Rangers started a search when the couple did not come back when expected, and their car was still at the trailhead after dark. The search team crossed mile marker 5 and found Daniel and Ruth Forsyth on the trail beyond the advisory boundary. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death for both as traumatic injuries to the neck and upper spine from animal attack with associated blood loss. They were 46 and 44 years old. Post-incident findings confirmed the advisory had been accurate and specific at the time they entered the trail. Both names were in the trailhead register signed after the board had been read. The bear spray had been discharged, but the angle and distance at the time of use meant it never reached effective concentration before contact. Tracks from 2 adult grizzly bears were identified, and the disturbance patterns were consistent with separate approach directions along the same feeding corridor. No immediate removal action was deemed necessary. It was the evening of October 3rd, 2016, in a private conservancy bordering the Masai Mara in Kenya, where the sky had turned deep orange and the savanna grass caught the last light of the day. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, the bush shifted. Animals that had rested through the afternoon heat began to move. The conservancy was the kind of place that looked, from a distance, like a postcard. Golden light, open plains, the silhouette of acacia trees against a fading sky. Madison Blake, 22, was an American Instagram model from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her account had grown steadily on the back of luxury travel content, carefully staged photographs in remote locations that made the wild look effortless and safe. She had roughly 31,000 followers and was building toward brand partnerships. Her content relied on proximity, not just beautiful landscapes, but herself inside them, close enough to make the image feel real. She had no formal wildlife training and had never been on a safari before this trip. Everything she knew about African wildlife came from what she had seen online. The version of Africa that exists on social media is curated, compressed, and stripped of consequence. It shows the golden hour and the elephant at sunrise. It does not show what moves through the grass after dark, or what happens when someone treats a wild landscape the same way they would treat a photo set. The first 2 days passed without incident. Madison photographed from the vehicle, but the results frustrated her. The animals were too far, the light too flat, the images too ordinary. By the second evening, she had begun pushing the guide, a local operator named Festus Ochieng, 46, to position the vehicle closer than standard practice allowed. Festus held firm on the core rules. No one exits the vehicle after dusk. No exceptions. I've seen this pattern before in my research, where someone with no real field experience starts treating a guide's instructions as suggestions rather than rules, and it almost always ends badly. What is worth understanding about Festus is that he was not being rigid for the sake of it. He had worked that conservancy for years. He knew what moved through the grass at dusk, and he knew that the rules he was enforcing were not arbitrary. They were written in the outcomes of situations exactly like this one. On the evening of October 3rd, the group stopped at an elevated ridge to watch the sunset. Madison wanted to frame herself against the horizon, standing outside the vehicle with the plains behind her. Festus refused. She waited until his attention shifted to another guest, then quietly stepped out, moving roughly 65 to 100 feet from the vehicle to find her angle. That distance sounds small on open ground, at dusk, separated from the vehicle by a stretch of grass that anything could be moving through. It is not small at all. What she did not know was that a clan of spotted hyenas had been active in the area since late afternoon. A fresh kill had been reported near a watering hole less than a mile from the ridge earlier that day. Spotted hyenas are not the passive scavengers most people picture. They are highly efficient hunters, capable of sustaining speeds near 37 miles per hour over distance, with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush bone entirely. They are most active at dusk and dawn, and they are acutely sensitive to isolated movement on open ground. What I find particularly important to understand about hyenas is that a healthy, upright adult human near a vehicle is not a target they typically pursue, but a lone figure at distance, separated from any large object moving unpredictably in fading light, is a completely different calculation for them. The vehicle matters. The group matters. The moment Madison stepped away from both, she changed what she looked like to everything watching from the grass. Madison was focused on her phone, adjusting her position against the fading light. She did not immediately notice the first animal emerge from the grass, roughly 80 feet to her left. It stopped and watched. Then a second appeared, further to her right, also stationary. Their low whooping calls carried across the ridge. Festus heard them from the vehicle and immediately looked toward Madison. He called out. She did not hear him or did not register the urgency in his voice. She saw the animals and froze. Then she turned and ran. This is the part that I think about every time I look at this case. Spotted. Hyenas have a well-documented chase response. A fleeing target triggers pursuit instinct in a way that a stationary one simply does not. Running was the worst possible reaction, and it sealed the outcome almost instantly. The nearest animal closed the distance within seconds, bit into her left calf, and pulled her down. It released and backed off briefly, still testing, but she was no longer upright, and that changed the dynamic entirely. A standing human registers differently than a human on the ground. Once she was down, the calculation shifted again. Festus was already driving toward her, horn blaring. The second animal moved in from the right. By the time the vehicle reached her position, Madison had sustained bites to her lower legs and one hand. Festus fired a warning shot, and the animals retreated into the grass. He got her into the vehicle and drove toward the Conservancy's airstrip. Madison remained conscious for the first several minutes, then went quiet from blood, loss, and shock. The wounds to her lower legs were severe. The femoral region of her left leg had been compromised, and bleeding could not be controlled in the field. She lost consciousness before the airstrip was reached. A medical team was waiting, but could not stabilize her. She was pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after the attack. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality. Festus was cleared of negligence. The hyenas were not destroyed. The Conservancy issued updated safety guidelines reinforcing the prohibition on exiting vehicles after 5 p.m. Madison's body was returned to Arizona. Her social media accounts remained active for several weeks before her family quietly archived them. The final post, uploaded the morning of October 3rd, showed the Kenyan plains at sunrise with a caption about chasing golden hour. She had been chasing it that evening too. She just did not understand what else was out there, chasing alongside her. The hyenas did not pursue her because she was there. They pursued her because she ran. That distinction is the part that is hardest to sit with. It was May 17, 2013, and the dense banana plantation across Costa Rica's Limon province had become a maze where hidden dangers lurked among towering stalks. One of Central America's deadliest snakes lay motionless in the undergrowth, waiting for a worker to pass too close. Mateo Rivas, 38, had 15 years on the plantations, moving faster than most through thick foliage. That morning, he aimed to finish early for extra overtime. His confidence in familiar terrain made him underestimate the danger waiting ahead, perfectly camouflaged. I keep thinking about how that familiarity probably blinded him to the predator lurking silently. The section Mateo worked was dense, with sunlight barely reaching the ground and fallen leaves hiding a massive fer de lance. Recent rain had pushed wildlife closer, and vipers had been spotted nearby. Warnings and signs of disturbed foliage should have made him cautious, but he moved efficiently, machete in hand, unaware of the predator just feet away. I can picture him stepping through the undergrowth, confident, yet blind to the danger ahead. The viper struck without warning. Mateo's left foot landed within striking distance, and the snake's fangs sank deep into his lower leg, injecting a massive dose of hemotoxic venom. The initial shock was probably confusing. He might have thought he had stepped on a thorn or broken branch, but within moments, the pain became unbearable. A burning, spreading agony that radiated up his leg. Swelling rose quickly, discoloration darkening the surrounding tissue, and a creeping sense of dread set in. I can't imagine the realization hitting him. The sharp, shocking understanding that this was no ordinary injury, that something lethal had pierced him, and there was nothing he could do to escape the consequences. Each heartbeat must have amplified the fear. Each second, a reminder of the venom coursing through his veins, systematically destroying tissue and attacking his very life. He tried to keep working, tried to push through, but the venom spread quickly. His legs swelled grotesquely, blood failed to clot, and tissue destruction began almost immediately. His heart raced, dizziness set in, and strength drained from his limbs. When his co-workers reached him, he was barely able to sit upright against a banana stalk. I can picture the panic in their eyes as they tried to carry him toward the road, knowing every moment counted, the hours stretching agonizingly as his body betrayed him. The journey to the clinic was brutal. Mateo's condition worsened with every step. Internal bleeding, shock, and organ strain left him barely conscious. By the time he arrived, massive envenomation and tissue destruction had overwhelmed him. Even with anti-venom and urgent care, it was too late. I keep imagining how powerless he must have felt, his body giving out with nothing able to stop it. The remote location and poor roads had made rapid help impossible. Doctors confirmed complete tissue necrosis, blood vessel damage, and systemic organ failure. I can't stop picturing that morning. The rustling banana leaves, the oppressive quiet after his last step. Afterward, the plantation increased safety training and protective equipment requirements, but nothing could bring Mateo back. His family received compensation, though it couldn't replace his presence or income. Among co-workers, the incident left a lasting impression. Workers now approached dense patches with caution, remembering how quickly a familiar landscape could turn lethal. The plantation, once just a place of routine labor, became a reminder that hidden dangers could lurk in even the most mundane corners of life. It's haunting to imagine how ordinary work turned deadly in an instant, and how quickly a place he knew so well became lethal. I keep replaying it in my mind. The calm, the quiet, and then that single bite changing everything forever. Even today, I think about the patterns of the leaves, the shadows along the ground, and how the snake's camouflage allowed it to remain undetected until it was too late. It's a stark reminder that confidence and experience can never replace caution when you're dealing with forces far stronger than yourself. One wrong step, one overlooked warning, and the consequences are irreversible. It was October 17, 2018, in the Limpopo region of South Africa. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, and the light over the dry grassland had turned orange and flat. The heat had been sitting over the reserve all day, and even at this hour, it had not let go. The safari vehicle moved slowly along the track, dust rising behind it, the guide keeping the engine low as the Pride came into view beneath a cluster of scattered trees. Rafael Duarte, 23, was a Brazilian TikToker whose online presence had started 2 years earlier with a video filmed in a beach parking lot at night after his girlfriend left him for a local gym instructor. He had paced in front of the camera, ranting about fearlessness and what women respected in men. The video spread because people found it funny. He had not intended to become a minor internet personality, and he had not intended to become a joke, but both things happened at once. He rebuilt his identity around appearing fearless, climbing unfinished buildings, entering abandoned sites, filming dares, but the engagement was dropping and he needed something that would work. The guide briefed the group before the vehicle entered the reserve. Stay inside at all times. Lions are accustomed to vehicles, but not to people on foot. Do not open doors. Rafael listened the way he listened to most safety instructions. That line told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. The vehicle stopped around 60 feet from the Pride. 3 lions were resting in the shade, tails flicking slowly, bodies relaxed. Other tourists were filming quietly. Rafael watched through his camera and decided it was not enough. The footage looked calm and still, and there was nothing in it that would restore the attention he had been losing for months. He waited until the guide turned to answer a question from another passenger. He opened the side door quietly, stepped out onto the track, and walked several feet from the vehicle with his action camera running. The lions did not move immediately. Rafael recorded himself standing outside the vehicle, commenting on the tourists inside, comparing himself to survival personalities. The lack of immediate reaction confirmed something in his mind that had been confirmed by every previous stunt that had not ended badly. Nothing had moved yet. He was still in control. This is where things went wrong for me reading this. He read the lion not reacting as proof he was safe. That is the last mistake he made. One lion lifted its head. It fixed its gaze on Rafael and held it there. Several seconds passed. Then, the animal rose slowly from its resting position. Its posture shifted. Its movement became deliberate. It began a slow forward advance through the dry grass, eyes locked on Rafael, closing the distance without hurrying. The guide saw Rafael outside the vehicle and began shouting immediately. He revved the engine and ordered everyone to stay seated. Rafael heard the shouting and saw the lion moving and understood that the situation had changed. He did not know whether moving suddenly would trigger a faster response. He hesitated. The lion did not hesitate. It lowered its body into a stalking posture and kept coming. Rafael started stepping backward toward the vehicle. His feet caught on the uneven ground and scattered brush along the track edge. He was watching the lion, listening to the guide, trying to keep the camera steady, and trying to find his footing all at the same time. He stumbled. The lion accelerated. It covered the remaining distance in seconds. Raphael was beside the safari track when it reached him, too far from the vehicle door to get back inside. The lion took him down with the full force of its weight behind the strike, driving him to the ground. The bite closed on his shoulder and upper chest. The animal's canines punctured deep into muscle and tissue, and one tooth caught along the right side of his neck, creating a laceration across the sternocleidomastoid muscle and partially severing the right external carotid artery. The injury was severe, and bleeding was immediate and heavy, but the left carotid remained intact. Raphael lost consciousness from acute blood loss, but remained alive. The guide and remaining staff initiated emergency response procedures immediately, using the vehicle and noise to push the animal back. Emergency services were contacted, and Raphael was airlifted to a hospital in the nearest city. Surgeons worked to address the vascular damage to his neck and shoulder, attempting to repair the severed artery and control the hemorrhage. The surgical team stabilized the vascular injury, but infection set in rapidly during recovery. Sepsis developed within hours and progressed despite aggressive antibiotic intervention and repeat procedures. Raphael died in hospital 68 hours after the attack. The cause of death was recorded as septic shock, secondary to deep cervical laceration with vascular injury, consistent with a large felid attack. Investigators confirmed he had exited the vehicle voluntarily after receiving clear safety instructions. It was March 15th, 2015. Broward County, Florida, sat under the kind of late winter warmth that the rest of the country hadn't reached yet. Humid, close, the kind of evening that gathers inside a house full of people and makes the air feel thicker than it should. Derek Holloway had hosted gatherings at his place before. He was known in his circle for the Python, had been for years. Derek was 34 years old. He worked as an HVAC technician out of Fort Lauderdale. Reliable, the kind of person who remembered people's names and showed up early without being asked. Outside of work, he was social, liked having his space filled, liked being the reason people gathered. What he knew about Burmese pythons, he had learned through years of dedicated reading and hands-on experience. The kind of self-education that covers most of the ground, but sometimes misses the edge cases until they arrive. He had kept the Burmese python since it was a juvenile, acquired through private channels, raised in an enclosure he had built in a back room, fed on a schedule that had become as routine as any other part of his week. Burmese pythons are one of the largest snake species on Earth, capable of exceeding 6 meters and 90 kilograms. They possess heat-sensing pits along the jaw that detect infrared radiation from warm-blooded animals with a precision that doesn't require sight or smell. In a warm, crowded room, every person present is radiating exactly the kind of thermal signature those pits are built to find. The snake was several meters in length by the time of the incident. There were 7 people in the room when Derek brought the python out. The house was warm. The snake had been in that warmth all evening, its thermal sensitivity responding to an environment saturated with biological signals. Derek had fed it 2 days prior, close enough that the feeding response had not fully reset, far enough that the timing felt unremarkable. He had done this before without incident. When something goes smoothly 20 times, the 21st doesn't feel different until it is. He draped the snake across his shoulders, the way he always had. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The python struck at Derek, at the warmth of his body, at the thermal signature of the person holding it in an environment the animal system had been processing for hours. Coils followed with the mechanical inevitability that large constrictor attacks always carry. Not frenzied, not loud, methodical. Constriction works not through suffocation, but cardiovascular arrest. The pressure a large Burmese python exerts is sufficient to prevent the heart from maintaining circulation long before the lungs stop working. The room had 7 people in it. 7 people who were present, who could see what was happening, who wanted to help. 2 grabbed at the coils immediately. The problem was everything around it. The shock, the lack of coordination, the complete absence of anything in that living room designed to interrupt a large constrictor mid-coil. No cutting tool within reach. No one trained in the specific technique, applying pressure behind the jaw, uncoiling from the tail end, that offers the best chance of interruption. They pulled. They repositioned. Someone called 911. Another ran for the kitchen and came back with nothing that worked. None of it came together in time. The cardiovascular compression that large constrictors produce does not pause for people to find their footing. By the time first responders arrived, the window that might have made a difference had already closed. What the witnesses described in the aftermath was not the chaos people might imagine. It was a specific, grinding helplessness. The experience of watching something catastrophic happen in slow motion while everything you try falls short by a margin you can feel but can't close. Several of them had interacted with the snake before that evening, had held it, had thought of it as part of what made Derek's place interesting. The investigation documented it clearly. A privately kept exotic constrictor, a warm, crowded environment, a feeding window that had not fully closed, and a handling decision made without the awareness that anything was different about that evening. Nothing about the animal's behavior leading up to the moment had registered as unusual to anyone in the room. That is the specific cruelty of thermal-triggered feeding responses in large constrictors. They do not build visibly. They do not announce themselves. They resolve in the span of time it takes for a room full of people to realize they are not watching a show. Derek Holloway died in his living room with 7 people watching. It wasn't. That's the part that stays with me. Nothing was different until it was. It was September 3rd, 2014, at the Brașov Regional Zoo in central Romania, and the maintenance lights along the Eastern Animal Corridor had been flickering for 3 days. Minor fault no one had gotten around to fixing, in a zoo where minor faults had a habit of becoming something worse. Elena Varga was 26, unemployed for 8 months, and had spent most of that time online. She had grown up in Cluj-Napoca, the daughter of a retired schoolteacher, and had briefly studied veterinary medicine before withdrawing in her second year. People who knew her described her as passionate and sincere, but increasingly isolated. Her social media activity in the months before September showed a fixation on captive animal welfare, particularly on Mika, a 9-year-old Eurasian brown bear housed at the Brașov facility. Elena had posted repeatedly that Mika's enclosure was too small, that his repetitive pacing was proof of psychological collapse, and that the zoo was willfully ignoring his deterioration. The Brașov Regional Zoo sat at the edge of a forested hillside, its older enclosures built to 1970s Eastern European standards, functional, minimal, not designed with modern safety redundancies in mind. Mika was a male Eurasian brown bear, standing roughly 6.5 feet tall on his hind legs and weighing an estimated 520 pounds. They are not aggressive by default, but they are profoundly territorial, and a confined bear with no outlet for flight behavior will default to confrontation when that territory is breached. Elena arrived at the zoo after closing, sometime around 8:40 p.m. She had brought a commercial bear spray canister, a deterrent product designed to temporarily incapacitate bears at a distance, not kill them. However, she claimed in an online post that in sufficient quantity it could be used humanely to euthanize an animal. This is medically and chemically false. She accessed the facility through an unsecured maintenance gate on the eastern perimeter, a known weak point that had been flagged in an internal safety memo 6 weeks earlier and had not been addressed. A keeper named Andrei Florescu was conducting a late equipment check in the service corridor adjacent to the bear enclosure when he saw Elena drop down from the interior gate lip and land inside the paddock. He triggered the enclosure alarm immediately and began shouting at her through the fence. Elena did not leave. Mika, who had been resting near the far wall, oriented toward her within seconds of her landing. He did not charge immediately. He stood, watched, and began to move in a low, deliberate walk that experienced handlers recognize as threat assessment. Elena raised the bear spray and discharged it. The enclosure's partial roof and internal ventilation created a lateral draft that pushed the cloud sideways and away from the bear. Mika continued forward. She discharged the canister a second time. It produced a short, weakened burst and was likely affected by short standoff distance and enclosure airflow disrupting dispersion, effectiveness. Poor aim combined with unstable airflow, reducing any meaningful cloud formation or coverage. She was now without any effective deterrent, and approximately 15 feet from a 520-pound animal that had closed more than half the distance between them. Mika struck her with a downward swipe to the left shoulder that dropped her to the ground and fractured her clavicle and 2 ribs simultaneously. What followed was a rapid and chaotic series of bites, pushing, and crushing body weight. He pinned her with his body mass, and the injuries sustained to her skull, neck, and thoracic cavity in the following short interval of under 2 minutes were unsurvivable. Andrei called emergency services from outside the fence while using a metal feed pole to strike the outer barrier and create noise. Response teams arrived 18 minutes later. Access delays through the zoo's locked secondary corridors pushed intervention to 26 minutes total. They could only declare Elena dead at the scene. In the weeks following, Romanian animal rights groups split sharply, some framing Elena as a martyr to captive animal welfare, others refusing to eulogize someone whose actions got an animal nearly killed. I think it's sad to think that Elena genuinely believed she was saving something. That belief was not grounded in any reality Mika was capable of understanding, and it cost her everything while changing nothing for him. It was August 3rd, 2015, Route National Forest, Colorado, a dispersed backcountry campsite in mixed forest terrain known for black bear activity. The kind of site experienced campers find without much effort, quiet, off the main routes. The sort of place that feels familiar the moment you set up. Gary Tipton was 45. He worked as a high school geography teacher in Pueblo, Colorado. He had been car camping for years and had completed 40 trips across 11 states before this one. He had never used proper food storage methods on any of them. No bear hang, no bear box. No separation between food and sleeping area. Nothing had ever happened. 40 trips and not a single problem. That record was the most important thing he carried into every campsite. 11 states, not one problem. I want to be honest. If I had that record, I might start to think the same way he did. That is what makes this case so easy to understand and so difficult to watch unfold. This campsite had a bear box. It was a 10-minute walk from where he pitched his tent. He noted it when he arrived and did not use it. He cooked bacon at 6 in the evening. The high-fat cooking residue moved through the trees the way it does, heavy and far-reaching. He cooked again at 10 at night, a late meal before bed. He left the residue on the stove where it sat. Before he got into his sleeping bag, he applied scented lip balm and placed his food bag in the tent vestibule, the covered outer section of the tent, separated from where he was sleeping by a single layer of tent fabric. His hiking partner was camped roughly 30 meters away. The partner had hung their food using a proper PCT hang, suspending it well away from the sleeping area with no food odors left near the tent. The two camps sat in the same forest that night under different conditions. Bears navigate by scent. They can detect food odors across distances that would surprise most people, and they move toward the strongest source with focus and consistency. What Gary had built over the course of that evening was a layered scent trail, pointing in a single direction. High-fat cooking residue twice over, grease on the stove, an unsecured food bag at the entrance to his tent, separated from him by fabric alone. Scented product applied directly to his face. Each element on its own would have been enough to draw interest. Together, they created a continuous gradient, pointing straight at where he was sleeping. The bear entered the campsite sometime in the night following that gradient. It did not remain at the partner's hang. There was nothing there to compete with the stronger source nearby. It continued along the scent trail until it reached Gary's tent. It pushed into the vestibule and began pulling at the food bag. The noise woke Gary. He moved inside the tent, disoriented and in the dark, and as the bear breached the vestibule, the barrier between them collapsed into immediate contact. The bear reacted to the sudden presence with a short defensive burst, biting into his face and upper chest and swiping hard before disengaging. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but the injuries to his face, neck, and chest were severe. The noise brought other campers out of their sleep. They emerged from their tents shouting and banging whatever they could find, moving toward Gary's campsite with torches. The bear registered the disturbance and moved back into the tree line. The campers reached Gary and found him on the ground outside the torn tent, bleeding heavily from his face, neck, and chest. They applied pressure to the wounds and tried to keep him still. He was conscious for a short time, enough to register that people were with him, and then lost consciousness before he could give a clear response. His condition deteriorated steadily from that point. The injuries were too extensive, and the bleeding too heavy for field treatment to hold. Someone called emergency services. The campsite was remote, and the hour was late, and it took time for paramedics to reach them. When they arrived, they worked on Gary at the scene, but he had already succumbed to his injuries before evacuation could begin. Gary Tipton was pronounced dead at the campsite. The cause of death was recorded as severe traumatic injuries and blood loss consistent with a bear attack at close range inside a tent. Post-incident findings confirmed the food storage guidelines had not been followed, despite a bear box being available at the site. Evening had created a concentrated scent environment at the sleeping location. The partner's use of proper food hang protocols was noted in the review. The bear had followed the only thing that had been made consistent: The partner 30 meters away followed the protocols. The bear walked straight past their camp. Gary's record of 40 trips without incident ended on trip 41. That breaks my heart. It was July 15, 2016, along a rural highway in Trang Province, Thailand. Traffic had slowed under the afternoon heat because a large king cobra was stretched across the road. Niran Pechkul, 34, was known around nearby areas as someone who could deal with snakes. He worked as a motorcycle mechanic, but on the side, he helped remove snakes from homes and small properties. He didn't have formal training, but he had done it enough times that he trusted himself. Small bites and close calls didn't scare him anymore. They just became stories he told. To me, it feels like this is where things start to go wrong. When you've done something enough times that you stop thinking about what could actually happen. That afternoon, Niran was riding home when he saw the traffic. He moved between the stopped vehicles and saw the cobra lying across both lanes. It was large, thick, and already watching everything around it. Some people had stepped out of their cars. A few were filming. Others just stood there, unsure what to do. I've seen situations like this before. Once people stop and gather, it usually makes things worse. The snake had its head raised slightly, hood partly open, following movement. A truck driver nearby warned people to stay back. A few others agreed and said it was better to wait, but Niran stepped forward and said he could move it. Honestly, this feels like one of those moments where everything depends on a single choice, whether you step in or just leave it alone. He walked behind the snake, planning to grab it the way he had seen in videos. But as he got closer, the cobra turned toward him, its head lifted higher, body tensing. Watching videos makes it look easy. Real life isn't like that. Niran moved quickly and tried to grab the head, but his hand landed too far back. The cobra reacted instantly. It twisted and struck. The first bite hit his left forearm as he raised it. Niran pulled back immediately and lost his grip. The cobra recoiled, hood flared wide, holding its ground. As he stumbled backward, his movement brought him close again. The snake struck a second time in quick succession, a defensive reaction rather than a pursuit. From what I know, once something goes wrong with a snake like this, the situation escalates fast. He managed to move a few steps, but something was already off. At first it was subtle. He looked unsteady. His movements slowed. When he tried to speak, his words didn't come out clearly. Then his breathing began to change, becoming shallow and strained. People around him didn't know what to do. Some shouted, others moved away. One person called for help. I don't think people freeze because they don't care. They just don't know how to react in a situation like this. Niran collapsed near the side of the road. The cobra lowered itself and moved away into the nearby vegetation. On the ground, his condition continued to deteriorate. He remained conscious for a short time, but he couldn't respond properly. His breathing grew weaker, each breath more labored than the last. Within around 15 minutes of the bite, it had become critically shallow. Emergency services arrived shortly after, finding him barely responsive and showing signs of severe neurotoxic envenomation. He was placed in an ambulance, but his condition deteriorated during transport. His breathing grew increasingly irregular as paralysis spread, and despite efforts to support his airway, he went into respiratory failure. He was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after. Arrival, approximately 40 minutes after the initial bite. The incident didn't get much attention. It was reported simply as a snake handling accident. People who knew him remembered him as someone who helped others, but also someone who got too comfortable doing something dangerous. I think that's what makes this hard. He wasn't trying to do something reckless. He just believed he could handle it. For me, this feels preventable. He didn't have to step in. People were already waiting, and help could have been called. I don't think he meant to take a big risk, but he still chose to. With something like a king cobra, there's almost no room for mistakes. Sometimes the safer move is just to leave it alone, even if you think you can handle it. Niran thought he could move the king cobra blocking the road, but one miscalculated grab proved fatal. His story shows how even someone experienced can be struck instantly, and the next story reminds us how a single step into dense brush can be just as deadly. It was the early morning of February 11, 2014, in a private conservancy in the Laikipia Plateau of central Kenya, where rocky outcrops broke the scrubland and fever trees lined dry riverbeds. The light was low and flat, ideal for photography. The Laikipia is quieter than the Mara, less trafficked, and the animals there move through the landscape with a kind of self-possession that is different from what you see in heavily visited reserves. Elena Petrova, 36, was a Russian wildlife photographer based in Nairobi. She had lived in Kenya for 4 years, working on a long-term personal project, documenting predator behavior in private conservancies. She was technically skilled and deeply familiar with the landscape, and she had photographed leopards on multiple occasions. Her guide was a local tracker named Mwenda Kariuki, 40, who had worked the Laikipia Conservancy for 8 years. Mwenda had noted Elena's tendency to push slightly beyond recommended positions, always seeking a cleaner angle or a less obstructed frame. Elena was not reckless in the way that Madison or Thomas were reckless. She had real knowledge, real experience, and a genuine understanding of the animal she was photographing. She had simply reached a point where her own judgment felt more reliable than the boundary she was being asked to stay within. The group had located a female leopard resting on a low granite outcrop, roughly 200 feet from the vehicle. Elena photographed from the vehicle for several minutes, then pushed to move to a position beside a large rock formation to the left for a direct sightline. Mwenda refused. Elena waited, then moved anyway, during a moment when Mwenda was speaking to another guest. Leopards are ambush predators that can shift from calm to a full attack in under a second, covering ground faster than most people can process. They are solitary, territorial, and highly sensitive to anything that enters their space from an unexpected angle. What made Elena's position particularly dangerous was not just the distance she had closed, it was that she had moved to a point that cut off the leopard's most direct escape route from the outcrop. A leopard that feels cornered does not wait. Elena crouched and adjusted her lens. Mwenda saw the leopard's posture change, ears flattening, body lowering, and called out sharply. Elena began to stand. The leopard came off the rock fast. It struck Elena across the face and left shoulder, driving her into the rock face. She was on the ground but conscious, trying to cover her face with her arms. The leopard bit into her left shoulder and upper neck, then released when Mwenda fired a warning shot. It did not go far. It retreated roughly 20 feet and crouched low in the scrub, watching. As Mwenda reached Elena and began pulling her upright, the leopard rose and took several steps forward. Mwenda fired a second warning shot directly in front of it. The animal stopped, held its position for a moment, then turned and moved into the brush at a slow, deliberate pace, not fleeing, just withdrawing. That detail has always stayed with me. It did not run, it left on its own terms. The wound to Elena's upper neck was deep and bleeding heavily. Mwenda applied pressure and drove back toward the Conservancy's base camp. She remained conscious for most of the drive, then lost consciousness in the final minutes. She died before a medical evacuation could be arranged. Blood loss from lacerations to the neck and shoulder. The attack had been defensive, not predatory, but the injuries were in a location where field intervention was not enough. Mwenda had done everything correctly from the moment the leopard moved. None of it was enough, because the wound was in a place where the margin between survivable and fatal was measured in minutes, and the nearest medical facility was too far away. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality. Mwenda was cleared of negligence. The leopard was not destroyed. Elena's camera was recovered intact, the last frame showing the leopard on the outcrop, calm and still, minutes before the attack. Her body was repatriated to Russia. She had spent 4 years in Kenya, building a body of work about predator behavior. The one thing she had not fully accounted for was the specific geometry of where she was standing, and that single miscalculation was the one that mattered. It was October 13th, 2018, a campground near Great Smoky Mountains, National Park, Tennessee. A Saturday evening in autumn, the air cold and smelling of damp leaves and wood smoke, flashlight beams moving between tents and RVs across the gravel roads. Ethan Walker was 20 and had lost 3 jobs in less than 3 years. At a hardware store, he had climbed shelving instead of using the rolling ladder and knocked boxes into a customer walkway. At a car wash, he had reversed a customer's truck across wet pavement without a manager present and clipped a metal station. At a barbecue restaurant, he had ignored a warning about a slippery kitchen floor, stacked too many trays, and nearly collided with a coworker carrying hot equipment. Each time he had been told clearly what the rule was. Each time he had decided the rule did not apply to him. Each time something had gone wrong, he had found a reason why it was not really his fault. He had started posting videos online. Most of them went nowhere. Then, during a trip to the Smokies in early 2018, he filmed himself climbing a roadside barrier to approach a wild elk while a park employee shouted at him to move back. The elk ignored him and kept grazing. The video spread. Thousands of strangers called him fearless. Ethan replayed the comments for days. For the first time in a long while, attention felt easy. 3 jobs, 1 viral video, and the comments that followed changed everything about how he saw himself. I wish the elk had reacted differently that day. After that, the content changed. Fences, drop-offs, wildlife. By October 2018, he had around 5,600 followers. Not enough to live on, but enough to dominate his attention. The camping trip that weekend had been planned mostly around content. Friends were asked to repeat reactions for better footage. Hiking clips were filmed multiple times. Rangers had spent the weekend reminding campers to secure food and stay at least 150 feet from bears after several sightings near garbage areas earlier in the week. Black bears are highly motivated by high-calorie rewards. Once a bear associates humans or campgrounds with easy food like trash, they become habituated, losing their natural fear of people, which significantly increases the risk of a defensive or predatory encounter. That Saturday evening, a black bear had been spotted near overflowing trash bins deeper inside the campground. The bear was partly turned away, head lowered towards scattered food and garbage, moving slowly. Ethan pulled out his phone almost automatically. One friend laughed nervously and told him he was actually insane. Another kept filming from further back and told him he was already close enough. Ethan kept walking. He stopped briefly to check his screen and make sure both his face and the bear were visible in the frame. 6 feet from a bear, and he stopped to check his framing. His phone was making the animal look further than it was. Every single thing in that moment was working against him. The bear had not reacted aggressively. To Ethan, that seemed reassuring. He moved closer. The bear shifted slightly beside the bin. Ethan interpreted the movement as proof the animal was used to people. Behind him, a friend told him more seriously to back up now. Ethan hesitated, but did not turn around. Too many people were watching behind him, and he was still recording. The bear lifted its head fully. The laughter behind Ethan stopped. The animal focused directly on him. The distance had closed to roughly 15 feet. The bear charged. It covered the gap instantly and made contact before Ethan could move. The initial strike knocked him off his feet. The bear bit into the right side of his neck and shoulder, the force of the jaw crushing the soft tissue and compromising the carotid artery. It drove him into the ground, pinning him by his chest. He had no time to cover himself and nothing to grab onto. His phone was still recording when it hit the ground beside him. Friends screamed. Someone ran for the ranger station. Someone else shouted and threw something toward the animal. The bear disengaged after several seconds and moved back toward the tree line. Rangers reached the scene within minutes. Ethan was unconscious and in profound hypovolemic shock due to rapid blood loss from the neck wounds. Bystanders had attempted to apply pressure, but the depth of the lacerations and the damage to the major vessels made the bleeding difficult to control in a field setting. Emergency responders initiated CPR and maintained advanced life support measures while transporting him to the nearest clearing for air evacuation. However, the physiological toll of the blood loss, combined with the trauma to the cervical spine during the initial strike, resulted in cardiac arrest during transit. Ethan was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the University Medical Center in Knoxville. The bear was tracked and euthanized the following morning. It was a young male that had been feeding on unsecured campground garbage for several days prior to the incident. The footage from Ethan's phone was reviewed as part of the park's incident report. The video showed him continuing to advance after 2 verbal warnings from his friends, and after the ranger advisory that evening had specifically addressed bear proximity. The park noted that the distance at the point of charge was consistent with a provoked defensive response at close range. No charges were filed. The incident report was added to the park's public safety record. The campground garbage management protocols were reviewed and updated the following season. It was October 7th, 2018. The hills had turned in the way eastern Kentucky turns in early October. The hardwoods going orange and rust along. The ridgelines, the mornings carrying a chill that hadn't been there a month before. The light sat lower and sharper across the hollow, where James Buckley's property sat back from the road. James was 47 years old. He was a coal equipment mechanic, spent his career on maintenance contract for the mining operations in Harlan County, known for fixing things others had written off. His wife, Carol, was the organizational center of the household, sharp where James was unhurried. Their teenage son, Marcus, had grown up working alongside his father, and Dale, the neighbor there that morning, was a longtime friend going back to when both men worked the same contract in the late 90s. James had raised a black bear from a cub after its mother was killed by a vehicle on a county road 3 years earlier. He kept it in an enclosure he built himself, never registered it, and named it Rue. It had grown into a full adult black bear, several hundred pounds. American black bears are highly intelligent and strongly food motivated, capable of forming associations between specific individuals and the delivery of food that persist across years. And that retention is not affection, it is conditioning. James had hand-fed Rue regularly and continued the practice as she grew. He entered the enclosure for feeding rather than using a pass-through. The boundary between keeper and food source had never been cleanly established, and nothing in 3 years had given anyone in that yard framework for what they were about to see. Rue had changed over the 3 years in ways that James had tracked practically. The size of her enclosure, the quantity of food required, the reinforcement schedule, but had not tracked behaviorally with the same precision. She was heavier and stronger in ways that were obvious. But the behavioral architecture underneath that physical growth, the deepening food conditioning, the accumulated pressure of years of enclosure entry feeding, was less visible precisely because it had developed so gradually. James had managed her successfully throughout, and successful management across time tends to produce its own blind spot. The feeding had been delayed that morning by about an hour and a half. Rue had been pacing the enclosure since her regular window had passed. James recognized the pacing. He had seen it before, and it had always resolved when he arrived with food. He went out to feed her with Carol on the porch, Marcus at the edge of the yard, and Dale leaning against the fence, watching. James entered the enclosure. Rue came toward him the way she always did, and that was precisely the problem. The movement that looked familiar was not the same movement it had been on other morning. The delay, the food conditioning, the absence of any spatial boundary, it had all converged. The transition from approach to engagement happened in seconds, small enough that Marcus said he didn't register what he was seeing as an attack until it was already fully underway. Carol came off the porch the moment she understood. Marcus was at the gate seconds later. Dale tried to pull it open and couldn't get it unlatched, hands shaking, urgency working against the fine motor control the latch required. Carol went back to the house for the rifle. Marcus got the gate open. None of it was in time. James Buckley died in his enclosure with his family in the yard. Not random, not without precedent, just invisible. The way these dynamics are always invisible to the people closest to them until the morning they aren't. What Carol and Marcus described in the weeks following was the specific difficulty of grieving something that had also been a part of their daily life. An animal they had known from when it was small enough to hold, that had eaten from their hands, that had been woven into the fabric of the property as completely as anything else on it. The loss was not clean. It carried a complexity that people outside that situation rarely have a framework for, and that complexity did not make the grief smaller. It made it harder to put down. It was September 23rd, 2017, and the narrow strip of overgrown land along a drainage canal on the outskirts of Davao region was quiet, humid, and crawling with hidden dangers. Tall grass and dense shrubs had grown unchecked, and the area was known for occasional sightings of large snakes. Elian Vargo, 19, was searching for his missing dog, Bruno. He was the responsible one in his family, working part-time at a local electronics shop while helping care for his elderly grandmother. Bruno had been wandering near the canal since morning, and Elian didn't want to wait until dark. I can picture him moving through the grass, calling out for his dog, thinking it'll be a routine search. That area isn't as safe as it looks. The vegetation was thick and uneven, with hidden roots and holes making every step uncertain. Local warnings about large snakes had been ignored, and signs of recent movement in the grass were easy to miss. Even from the edge, it would have been difficult to spot anything lying still beneath the cover. Elian pushed forward, calling Bruno's name, unaware of the reticulated python coiled under the grass just a few feet away. Around 15 feet long, it struck instantly, biting his left thigh as it attempted to coil around his lower body in uneven partial wraps. He fell backward into the dense vegetation as the python tightened. The grass and branches scratched his arms and face, but the crushing pressure around his torso stole his focus. Every struggle only gave the snake more leverage. The coils shifted and tightened, restricting his movement further rather than forming a stable lock. The uneven ground made footing impossible, and every stumble let the coils squeeze harder. His chest felt trapped in a vice, His legs burned as circulation slowed, and each shallow gasp reminded him that fighting back only worsened the grip. I can't imagine that panic, knowing every move just makes it worse, knowing there's nothing you can do. Within minutes, Elian couldn't breathe properly. His chest was compressed, lungs unable to expand, and the coils on his legs cut off circulation. Each attempt to call for help produced only weak gasps. I would have been panicking so hard at this point, trying to shout, trying to move, feeling the air get pulled out of my lungs. The struggle was chaotic and uneven, with the python adjusting its coils as he fought to break free. His breathing became increasingly restricted, and his movements weakened over time. After several minutes of mounting pressure, he lost consciousness. It's terrifying to think about the time stretching out like that, helpless, with something so strong around you. By nightfall, when Elian didn't return, his family searched with flashlights. His uncle found him about 2 hours after the attack, still partially entangled in the vegetation where the attack happened. Emergency services arrived 25 minutes later, but the snake had already retreated. I can't imagine the shock of seeing him like that, knowing it was too late. The coroner confirmed rib fractures from severe constriction and asphyxiation, consistent with a reticulated python attack. He was believed to have lost consciousness from prolonged compression and later died from respiratory failure caused by the injuries. Bruno's remains were found nearby days later, suggesting he may have been the first victim. It's heartbreaking to realize the dog led him right into danger without anyone noticing. After the incident, local officials posted additional warnings and increased patrols, but little else changed. Elian's family moved away within 6 months, unable to face the memories. Looking back, I feel like this could have been avoided. He didn't know he was in real danger. The area seemed quiet, familiar, but one wrong step in the wrong place, and it became fatal. I don't blame him. He just had no idea what was waiting there. Elian never expected Bruno to lead him straight to a 200-pound reticulated python, and by the time it struck, there was no escape. His story demonstrates the sudden danger of overgrown, familiar spaces, and the following account proves that tight, confined areas can be just as deadly. It was November 3rd, 2018. The Limpopo bushveld had entered its early wet season, the grass coming up green after the dry months, the mornings humid, the heat building through the day, and releasing in late afternoon storms that moved fast across the flat land. On private farms in the region, the size of the properties and the distances between homesteads create a kind of operational independence that those who live there absorb as simply the condition of that life. Peter Van Wyck was 62 years old. He had spent most of his working life as a farm manager across Limpopo and Mpumalanga, meticulous, record-keeping, the kind of man who understood systems and had the patience to maintain them over decades. His daughter Anki, 31, lived in Pretoria and visited when she could, more out of concern for a man living alone than obligation. His farm workers, Joseph, Elias, and a younger man who had been there less than a year, were part of the property's daily structure. Joseph had worked for Peter for nearly a decade, Elias for 6. They knew Luther. Peter had kept a male lion on his property for 11 years, acquired through the captive breeding network that operates extensively in southern Africa, purchased as a cub and raised as a private companion in a large enclosure adjacent to the main farmstead. He called the lion Luther. African lions are the only truly social member of the cat family, and in the wild, a pride male's authority is maintained through constant social signaling. In captivity, that architecture collapses to the single relationship between keeper and animal, and that relationship is asymmetric in a way that never resolves. The signals a lion uses to calibrate where a person stands in its world are body language, scent, and the behavioral confidence that comes from physical authority. Luther had become part of the rhythm of the property, in the same way that any long-standing routine becomes invisible through repetition. The farm workers had organized their mornings around the feeding schedule without consciously deciding to. Anka, on her visits, had come to think of the enclosure as simply a feature of the place, present, contained, managed. 11 years of uneventful history had distributed the weight of the risk across so many ordinary mornings that no single morning felt like it carried very much of it. Luther had grown to over 200 kilograms. Peter had managed him for 11 years through strict routine and daily attentiveness. Fatal captive lion incidents in southern Africa follow a documented pattern. The keeper is almost always experienced, the animal almost always familiar, and the incident almost always occurs when the keeper's reading of the animal's behavioral state is slightly out of alignment with where the animal actually is. 11 years of successful management does not reduce that risk. In some respects, it increases it. Luther had been pacing since early morning. Peter noticed it and attributed it to the weather change. He had fed Luther in a pacing state before, and the animal had always settled when food arrived. That assessment was not unreasonable, given his history. It was also, on that particular morning, wrong, in a way the pacing alone did not make obvious. Peter entered the enclosure. What the farm workers described, and what Anke described from the veranda, was a sequence that lasted less than 30 seconds from entry to irreversible outcome. Luther did not come to the food. Luther came to Peter. The distinction is real between an animal that is hungry and one in a predatory state where hunger and prey drive have merged into something that food alone will not redirect. The signals had been there since early morning, carrying a charge that 11 years of familiarity had made harder, not easier, to read. Joseph ran for the rifle in the equipment shed. Elias stopped at the outer fence. There was nothing he could do there, and he knew it. The third worker was already on the phone. Anke came off the veranda at a run and stopped at the outer gate for the same reason. The inner enclosure was a space nobody was entering while Luther was in it. The rifle reached the fence in time to end what was happening. It did not reach the fence in time to change what had already occurred. Peter Van Wyck died inside the enclosure he had built, 11 years into a relationship with an animal that had given him 11 years of reason to believe he understood it. The investigation documented an unlicensed, unregistered adult male lion, unknown to any regulatory system, maintained by a single person whose death left nobody else on that property with any means of managing it safely. What Anke described afterward, in the account that stayed with me, was the specific experience of watching from the veranda and understanding what was happening before she had words for it. The kind of comprehension that arrives in the body before it arrives in the mind. She had run before she had consciously decided to run, and she had stopped at the gate, not because she didn't want to go further, but because some part of her understood, without being told, that the gate was as far as the situation was going to let her go. It was March 18th, 2018, in the Northern Territory of Australia. The afternoon was fading, and the riverbank was quiet in the way that remote places are quiet. Not peaceful exactly, just empty of anything human. The mangroves pressed in close on both sides, and the water between them was dark and gave nothing back. Nguyen Minh, 26, had come from Vietnam with a tripod, 2 camera bags, and a plan that made sense to him in the way plans make sense to people who have never had one go badly wrong. His channel had started by accident. A video of him nearly slipping off a waterfall in Dalat had gone viral without warning. Comments calling him fearless. Sponsorship money that helped his parents. The earlier video had taught him the wrong lesson. Surviving danger had started to feel like understanding it. That is the sentence I stopped at. Surviving something and understanding it are not the same thing. That gap is what brought him to that riverbank. But as time went by, the numbers were down. Newer creators were filming things that made his content look cautious by comparison, and his audience had noticed. He had been watching Australian crocodile jump videos for weeks. Clips of saltwater crocodiles launching vertically from the water towards suspended bait. He told his followers he was going to film the closest crocodile jump ever recorded. He believed the gap between what looked dangerous and what actually was dangerous was something he could manage. He arrived at the river system and walked past the designated tourist platforms without stopping. I need to point this out. The safe version of exactly what he wanted was right there. Steel mesh. Proper positioning. He walked past it and kept going for nearly a mile. They were reinforced with steel mesh and positioned well back from the water. He kept going, nearly a mile into a restricted area marked with warning signs, until he found a section of bank that felt right. The ground was mangrove root and mud that stayed wet regardless of the sun. He tested the footing twice before setting up and convinced himself it was stable enough. He positioned his tripod near the waterline and began his live stream. The stream quality dropped repeatedly as the connection weakened near the river system. Viewers later reported the feed freezing several times before anything happened. The water was flat and nothing happened. Chat messages came in accusing him of staging it. His feet were on a moss-covered root above the mud, and his eyes were on his phone screen. A wildlife ranger named Daniel was on patrol nearby when he spotted movement along the restricted bank. At first, he assumed someone was illegally baiting crocodiles for footage. He saw the tripod and the rope with bait hanging above the water, and as he got closer, he understood the full situation. He left his vehicle and ran toward the bank, shouting for men to move back. By the time the crocodile surfaced, there was almost no time left to react. Min tried to pull back. His foot slipped. He reached for a tree trunk nearby and briefly caught it, but his weight had already moved past the point where catching anything would help. He went forward and down toward the water. The crocodile took him by the torso at the waterline. The bite closed with enough force to fracture several ribs and compress the chest cavity on contact. The animal immediately initiated a death roll, rotating its body violently in the water to destabilize and submerge its target. The rolling motion caused catastrophic internal injuries and drove him below the surface. A saltwater crocodile of that size generates enough rotational force to tear through muscle and bone. He would not have remained conscious for long after the initial bite. Mercer reached the bank within seconds and initially believed Min had surfaced farther down the bank. He searched the shoreline for several seconds before realizing he was gone. The cause of death was later recorded as traumatic internal injuries and drowning consistent with crocodile attack. The combination of the initial bite, the death roll, and submersion meant survival was not possible after the first seconds of contact. The live stream had kept recording through the freezes and the signal drops. Recordings spread across platforms within hours. Nguyen Min was pronounced dead at the scene. His body was recovered the following morning. His camera equipment was still on the bank where he had positioned it. One of the camera batteries was still charging through a portable power bank when investigators recovered the equipment. Investigators concluded he had deliberately entered a restricted area, ignored multiple warning signs, and misjudged how quickly the crocodile could close the gap. The safety margin he believed he had did not exist. It was August 4th, 2014. The heat sat over the land the way Central Texas heat always does in early August. Heavy, flat, radiating back up from the earth. On rural properties outside any municipal boundary, the afternoon carried the particular stillness of a place far enough from infrastructure that the world, beyond the fence line, barely registers. Ray Garza's property was that kind of place. He had built it to be. Ray was 51 years old. He had spent 20 years as a pipeline inspector in the oil and gas sector before an early retirement following a back injury. The rural property outside Bastrop was what he had worked toward. Land, distance, self-sufficiency. He was private but not unfriendly, the kind of man who helped without being asked and expected nothing in return. The tiger was consistent with who he was, an extension of the impulse to do something nobody he knew had done, on land he had earned. He had kept a Bengal tiger on his property for 6 years, acquired as a cub through back-channel connections in the private exotic animal trade. No permit, no registration. He called it Sultan. Bengal tigers are estimated by wildlife organizations to number in the thousands in private U.S. ownership, more held privately in Texas alone than exist in the wild across all of India. They reach full adult size between 3 and 4 years, with males regularly exceeding 200 kilograms, and their territorial range in the wild can exceed 100 square kilometers. An enclosure is not a territory. It is a compression of everything that territory is for. Sultan had become something of an open secret in Ray's world, not widely known, but known enough that a small orbit of people understood what was on that property and had made peace with it. Ray spoke about the tiger, the way people speak about things they have lived alongside long enough to stop fearing, not recklessly, but with the settled confidence of someone who had managed the situation successfully across years and had drawn conclusions from that success. 6 years without a serious incident is a long time. It is also, in the context of a fully grown Bengal tiger, exactly long enough to stop feeling like luck. The gathering that afternoon was a family event. Ray's wife, his adult son, 2 grandchildren under 10, a brother-in-law down from Austin. People who had seen Sultan before, who understood in the abstract that the animal was dangerous, but for whom that danger had been softened by repetition into something that felt theoretical. Ray fed Sultan in front of family routinely. Their experience said this was safe. The feeding that afternoon had been delayed by nearly 3 hours. In the management of large captive felids, a delayed feeding is not a neutral event. Bengal tigers operate on internal rhythms that do not flex easily around human scheduling. And the longer the delay, the more the animal's arousal builds towards something that is no longer simply hunger. Sultan had been pacing and vocalizing for over an hour before Ray went in. The signals were there, and the family gathered outside the fence was not trained to read them. Ray entered the enclosure with the feed. The attack came fast. His wife screamed. His son reached the fence and tried to get the gate open, but the latch, the same one that kept Sultan contained, now kept everyone else out. His brother-in-law ran for the house to find a weapon. The grandchildren were pulled back by instinct. It was over before the firearm was retrieved. What the family described afterward, and what families in documented big cat incidents across the United States have described in consistent terms, is the way the fence transformed the experience of witnessing into something different from ordinary helplessness. They could see everything. The distance between them and Ray at any given moment was measured in meters, not miles. And none of that proximity translated into the ability to do anything that mattered. Ray Garza died inside the enclosure in front of 5 members of his family. The investigation documented a privately kept, unregistered Bengal tiger, an illegal arrangement maintained in secrecy for 6 years, and a set of variables: delayed feeding, high ambient temperature, keeper entering during peak arousal, that the animal's behavioral state had been building toward all afternoon. No fence in the world keeps a family out faster than it keeps an apex predator in. It was August 12, 2018, and the small wildlife park outside Polokwane should have been a fun stop on Leora's trip. But that day, it became a disaster waiting to happen. Thick concrete barriers and glass separated visitors from the snakes, and yet one wrong step would turn everything upside down. Leora Dane, 29, had built a modest following on her social media platform, always chasing the next daring shot. I can picture her scrolling through her feed earlier that morning, thinking she needed something epic for this post. She had a reputation among her friends for ignoring warnings and pushing limits, brushing off caution as unnecessary. That afternoon, the 15-foot king cobra appeared still behind the glass enclosure, and Leora thought she could handle it. I keep imagining her confidence, her arm stretching over the barrier, believing she was safe. Her friends egged her on, filming every move with their phones. They thought the glass and concrete were enough to keep her safe, but the snake didn't read the script. King cobras are large and fast, and even slight disturbance in close range can trigger a rapid defensive strike. It's the kind of thing you think you can control until reality hits. Then, there's no control at all. When Leora reached over the barrier, her hand moved just past the designated viewing boundary, briefly entering the snake's immediate strike range near the enclosure glass. The king cobra reacted instantly, lifting and driving its head forward in a rapid defensive strike and biting her forearm before she could fully retract her arm. The contact lasted only a moment, but it was enough for staff to immediately recognize what had happened and move in. Staff reacted within seconds, stepping in with controlled urgency to pull her back from the enclosure and secure the surrounding area so no one else could approach. The response was fast and coordinated, focused on separating her from any further risk while assessing her condition. I can't stop picturing how quickly she must have realized what had happened, the shock setting in almost immediately. Within minutes, she began showing early signs of neurotoxic envenomation, starting with slurred speech and a noticeable loss of control in her facial and throat muscles. Her breathing gradually became more labored, with short, shallow attempts to inhale becoming more frequent. She remained conscious, but increasingly weak, and was placed under close medical monitoring as responders initiated immediate treatment and prepared for possible respiratory support using rapid stabilization measures. Paramedics arrived shortly after and transported her to hospital while she was still conscious, but weak and unstable. She was placed on ventilatory support as respiratory weakness progressed. Over the following hours, her breathing continued to deteriorate due to neurotoxic effects, and despite intensive resuscitation efforts, she later died in hospital from respiratory failure caused by king cobra envenomation. The park shut the exhibit for review, raising barriers and adding briefings. Leora's case was later used in internal safety reviews and public awareness materials about enclosure risk. Local news covered the incident moderately, highlighting how a brief lapse in judgment near a wildlife enclosure can lead to a serious medical emergency that develops rapidly after exposure. Honestly, it makes me think twice about even leaning over, a railing near a wild animal. Looking back, I don't think Leora was reckless out of stupidity. She underestimated the danger, but it was completely preventable. The warnings were clear. The barriers were there for a reason, and even a brief moment of overconfidence was enough to put her in real danger. If I were there, I would have stayed back. Some animals are simply too strong and too fast to play with, no matter how brave you think you are. Leora reached beyond the safety barrier toward the enclosure, underestimating the speed and defensive response of the snake. And the next story proves that even experienced plantation workers aren't immune to hidden threats. It was February 11th, 2016. The morning arrived the way Philippine mornings do in the dry season. Bright early, the air still carrying a trace of overnight cool before the heat established itself fully. In the residential outskirts where smaller lots bordered agricultural land, the distances between neighbors were close enough that daily routines became shared knowledge. People knew each other's schedules. They knew each other's animals. Rodrigo Aquino was 58 years old. He had spent his adult life as a small-scale fish trader, working the supply chain between local fishing boats and the wet markets along Davao's outskirts. He was known in his neighborhood as a practical man, someone whose word held, who applied steady consistency to everything he was responsible for. The crocodile fit that pattern, and had simply grown over 9 years into something that required a different quality of consistency than he had ever been trained to provide. He had kept a saltwater crocodile on his property for 9 years, acquired as a juvenile through the informal wildlife network that operates across the Philippine archipelago, raised in a concrete enclosure along the back edge of his lot. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptilian species on Earth. Males can exceed 6 meters and 1,000 kilograms. Their bite force is the strongest of any animal alive today, and the death roll, the rotational behavior used once contact is established, anchors the bite and spins the body along its longitudinal axis with enough force to incapacitate and dismember, something that cannot be interrupted from outside a fence by a person without specialized equipment, unregistered, unknown to any authority, but known to everyone on his street. Over those 9 years, the crocodile had grown from a juvenile that Rodrigo could manage with relative confidence into an animal whose physical capacity had long since outpaced anything his enclosure was genuinely designed to contain against. The concrete walls had been built for a different animal, smaller, newer, less established in its environment. What Rodrigo had done, incrementally, and without any single decision that felt significant, was continue a routine that the animal had grown into, rather than one that had grown with it. On the morning of February 11th, 6 neighbors were present, 3 passing on their way to work, 2 whose lots adjoined Rodrigo's, and a child who had wandered over from 2 houses down. None of them were inside the enclosure. None had any means of intervention that would have mattered. Rodrigo entered the enclosure with the morning feed. What happened next was not preceded by warning signs the gathered neighbors reported recognizing. What crocodilian researchers document across captive owner incidents is that the behavioral signature of an impending attack is often invisible to untrained observers, because the attack is not a response to threat. It is an opportunistic event, triggered by proximity and movement and the accumulated feeding association of 9 years, executed with the economy of an animal that has not changed its approach to prey in millions of years. 2 of them ran for help. 1 tried to find something to throw. The child stood at the fence and did not move, for reasons that nobody who has ever been frozen by shock needs explained to them. What the witnesses had to sit with afterward was not just what they had seen, but the specific texture of having been close enough to see it clearly, and far enough to be entirely useless. They had watched this feeding before, most of them many times, and nothing in those prior mornings had given them a vocabulary for what they experienced on this one. The neighborhood's long familiarity with the crocodile had not prepared anyone for the reality of the animal at full engagement. It had done the opposite. Rodrigo Aquino died in his enclosure on a bright February morning with 6 people watching who could not reach him. 9 years of routine that had become so familiar it had stopped carrying the weight of what it actually was. And a morning that looked identical to every other morning until the moment it didn't. It was July 21st, 2018, in a Kenyan wildlife reserve near the Masai Mara. The late afternoon light was warm and orange across the dry grassland, and a large elephant herd was moving through a crossing on the dirt road ahead. The dust they raised drifted slowly in the still air. The safari vehicle had stopped to let them pass. Daniela Ferreira, 21, was a travel content creator from Indonesia who had built her following around dance videos filmed in unusual places: airports, rooftops, waterfalls. She described her content as cinematic and dreamlike, and her audience responded to it. She had been brought to Kenya by a small travel company that wanted scenic safari footage for a sponsored campaign. The company wanted harmless tourism content. Daniela wanted one clip that would be different from anything she had posted before. For months, she had been thinking about filming herself, dancing beside wild elephants in open savanna. She believed it would be peaceful and visually powerful, and exactly the kind of thing her audience would share. The guide briefed the group before they entered the reserve. Stay seated, no loud movements, maintain distance from the herd. Elephants with juveniles can become unpredictable very quickly. Daniela listened and then asked if she could step outside briefly to film a dancing clip beside the herd. The guide refused immediately and repeated the warning. Daniela said she would stay close to the vehicle and it would only take a few seconds. She got out anyway with her phone in selfie mode. The guide said no, but she felt she knew better. I've heard that reasoning before, and it never ends the way the person saying it expects. She started filming close to the vehicle. Then she moved slightly to change the angle. Then again, to get more of the herd in frame. She was looking at her phone screen while she moved, and the distance between her and the vehicle grew without her registering it clearly. Her attention was on the composition, not on what the herd was doing. This is the moment that changed everything. The elephants had been crossing normally. Then, one older female stopped. Her ears spread outward. Several trunks lifted into the air. The younger elephants pulled together tightly in the center of the group. A loud cracking sound came from somewhere in the reserve nearby, the kind of abrupt noise that moves through a herd fast. The tension spread through the crossing formation within seconds. The guide saw it and began shouting for Daniela to return immediately. He started the engine and tried to get her attention. The tourists inside the vehicle had already understood that something had changed. Daniela heard the shouting and saw the shift in the herd, but misread it as a dramatic visual moment and backed slightly further into the roadway to keep the whole herd in frame. The matriarch pivoted. The herd broke from a controlled crossing into a panic-driven surge. Dust rose heavily across the road as multiple elephants pushed through at once. Daniela turned toward the vehicle and realized how far she had drifted from it. The ground was uneven and the dust had reduced visibility. The herd was moving across the road between her and the Jeep. One adult elephant came through the moving herd and struck her with a lateral movement of its head and tusk as it pushed forward with the momentum of the group behind it. The impact was not a targeted attack. The animal was moving with the herd, and she was in its path. The force of a full-grown elephant moving at speed is several tons of weight in motion. She was thrown sideways onto the road. Her phone landed in the dirt nearby and kept recording. The footage showed dust and violent shaking and shouting from the direction of the vehicles. Safari staff secured the remaining tourists and initiated emergency response immediately. Reserve authorities were contacted, and the crossing area was restricted. Responders reached Daniela on the road. The injuries from the impact were severe, including internal trauma and crush injuries to the chest and torso, consistent with being struck by a large animal at force. She was transported by emergency vehicle to the nearest medical facility. Despite medical intervention, Daniela Ferreira died from her injuries. She was 21 years old. The cause of death was recorded as traumatic internal injuries, consistent with impact from a large elephant during a herd movement event. Investigators later reviewed the recovered phone footage and the guide's account. They concluded Daniela had exited the vehicle voluntarily after being refused permission and warned of the risk, that she had drifted farther from the vehicle while focused on filming, and that the herd's panic response had been triggered by an environmental sound rather than any direct provocation. Her body was repatriated to Indonesia following the investigation.